When Days Gone released in 2019, I didn't care about it. It was another PlayStation exclusive, third-person, cinematic zombie shooter. You've probably seen the jokes about PlayStation exclusives, and while I don't necessarily agree with them, in 2019 I was definitely tired of this kind of game. I had played God of War, Uncharted, The Last of Us, Spider-Man, and even Horizon Zero Dawn, so why would I want to play another game like those without the appeal of a familiar face or the curiosity of a unique setting? Something had changed by the time I did play Days Gone in 2021, and no, not just the fact that it had been released on Steam, but that did help. I was interested, but hesitant. I went in with low expectations and came out on the other side recommending the game to people around me. Everything I had seen about Days Gone leading up to my own playthrough was full of middling praise or even jokes at the game's expense. Yet I really enjoyed my time with Days Gone. I would go as far as saying I loved the game and thought it was a unique showing for the single-player open-world framing. Aside from technical issues on launch that seemed to have been ironed out, I couldn't tell what game everyone had been talking about for the last 2 years. It felt like I was playing something they hadn't, something they didn't really take the time to meet on its level, or a game that they just wrote off for not being as focused as The Last of Us, or as exciting as God of War. I think, more than anything, Days Gone was misunderstood. It isn't a game that tried to go for mass appeal with a simplified gameplay loop, or easy mechanics and systems for you to play on autopilot. Days Gone expects you to play the game a certain way, and it expects you to put yourself in the world and play as a survivor in post-apocalyptic Oregon. I don't think the game was maliciously treated, I just don't think it was taken seriously and written off as another drop in the open world bucket. I think you were wrong about Days Gone, just like I was. But let's back it up a bit and talk about how Days Gone came to be. Revealed at a PlayStation E3 showcase in 2016, no, I haven't forgiven the world for tricking everyone into thinking E3 was pointless. The reveal was praised for its technical prowess and grounded world, especially focusing on the massive horde featured in the gameplay demo. The game showcased in previews over the next few years differs from the one we got, like a lack of binary choices in the story that claimed to affect how things would play out, or some more intense environmental reactions, like a flood of infected being blown into a bandit camp. I think these being missing from the final game don't detract much. Binary story choices that pretended to give you a choice in the narrative were already on the way out in the industry, and while the environmental interactions look cool and exciting, I doubt it would have been easy to include on a wide scale for a lot of encounters, probably ending up as a rare possibility rather than the rule. But who was making this new open-world, grand-scale, richly detailed, and other buzzwords experience? The guys at Ben Studio, responsible for Siphon Filter, probably haven't heard that name in a decade, if ever, and Bubsy 3D. Yeah, well, they can't all be winners. Ben Studio had primarily been a first-party support developer for PlayStation since the mid-2000s, releasing portable games of their exclusive franchises like Resistance and Uncharted. So Days Gone was their first attempt at an original IP in over a decade, and the first time they were helming up development themselves since 2011. I don't have much to say about the history of Ben Studio. Days Gone seems to have been their first crack at a AAA release since Siphon Filter, and I think that's fine. You gotta keep the lights on somehow. I do have something to say about the release of Days Gone though, specifically some dialogue surrounding the game after it came out. I want to distance myself from this for this video and my opinion of the game following, so I'm gonna call it out now. Ben Studio's previous creative director, John Garvin, is a bit of a character. He's been online the last few years ardently defending the game from woke criticism and fluffing the game up to be bigger than what it was, like diminishing the appreciation from Team Asobi featuring Days Gone in Astrobot. I don't want to harp on the rampant tweeting from some weirdo that makes Web 3.0 NFT games, but he's been a volatile aspect of the discussion around the game. And while I agree with him that the discussion around Days Gone might have missed the mark, I really doubt it's from those woke reviewers he's making up. Maybe try pointing out what really made the game special instead of creaming your shorts over your female lead. Which is what I intend to do here for this video. Not the part about the female lead, but pointing out why Days Gone was more than what you thought it was, and how you might have missed out on an interesting drop in that open world bucket. The story in Days Gone is long, really long, and very interwoven with multiple storylines throughout the game, making talking about the narrative a bit of a mess. Not to say the main throughline with Deacon St. John's journey is a mess, but it's difficult to weave a comprehensive plot without oversharing details from multiple threads. I want to say this up front and at the beginning just to clarify the progression of some plot beats during my retelling. This is going to be an attempt at an abridged retelling. Even still, it's going to be a pretty long one because I do think there's a lack of earnest coverage for the game in this YouTube video essay space thing that I'm trying to push my way into, and I want Days Gone to get a fair shake, so talking about the very long story is part of that shaking. But if there are any points that you think I missed, or some details that might seem fuzzy, it might be covered in the game, but may not have been relevant to my summarization here. Hopefully the Gavin that's editing this puts some text on screen to fill in the blanks that might help if I think my voiceover isn't doing a good enough job. I'm also not going to have a pre-spoilers section during the narrative bit of this video like I usually do. I don't really think there's a good place to break off in the early hours of the game, and talking through half of the game just to say, hey, spoilers ahead, seems silly. So here's your spoiler warning up front. I think the narrative of Days Gone is a little rough around the edges and definitely a slow burn, but it is worth seeing if you're interested in the game. There's some good payoffs, character development, some fun twists and turns, and it's probably the largest reason to keep chugging along in the game as a whole. So yeah, click to the time on screen now to skip the entire story retelling with my input and whatever if you don't want to ruin it for yourself. No extra warning later. And with those wordy disclaimers out of the way, we can finally get right into it. The story starts at the beginning of the outbreak. We see our protagonist, Deacon St. John, kneeled over his wife Sarah, wounded and bleeding out. Deacon and his best friend Boozer help Sarah to her feet and carry her to a nearby rooftop where an evacuation helicopter has been spotted. The man intaking survivors stops the couple, saying that he can't take any more people on the flight, but Deacon tries to appeal to his emotions, noticing his badge and his name, O'Brien, and speaking to him candidly. O'Brien continues to explain that the helicopter is at capacity, so Deacon pulls a gun on him, instead turning to threaten him to take Sarah to wherever they're heading. O'Brien obliges, saying that he can take 2 more people. Boozer, having just made it to the rooftop, tells Deacon to go with Sarah, since he heard that they can only take 2 people, but he thinks he'll be able to manage on his own. Deacon notices a pretty deep wound on Boozer's leg and heads back to the helicopter, asking O'Brien where this evacuation is heading so that he and Boozer can meet up with the evacuation camp later. Deacon gives Sarah one of his rings, a decorated silver ring in the shape of a dog's skull, a symbol of his ties to his motorcycle club, the Mongrels. The helicopter takes off and Boozer questions Deacon's decision. We cut to about 2 years later, 2 years into the apocalypse. Deacon and Boozer are still riding together, looking much worse for wear, but still alive. We join Deke and Boozer in the middle of a manhunt, looking for someone named Leon. As the two try to talk to a wounded woman, Leon drives by, speeding past them. The two mount up and chase Leon, slowly wearing down his motorcycle until he's forced to ditch it. Leon runs on foot, briefly exchanging bullets with the bikers and ruining Deacon's bike by puncturing his fuel pump. Leon doesn't get far though, as he was shot during the shootout and quickly bleeding out. The two men interrogate Leon for the location of a stash of drugs that he stole, and we end the scene with Deacon executing Leon instead of leaving him for the infected to rip him apart. Boozer claims a proof of kill from Leon's body, and they head back to their bikes. Deacon tries to hide his bike nearby so they can find parts to repair it and fix it up, suggesting that they look for the parts tonight and repair it while they're already out, noticing a billboard for a nearby auto shop. Along the way, the boys have to clear a tunnel with nests of freaks, a colloquial throughout the game for infected people. While clearing out a nest, Deacon goes a little overboard, killing a freak. Boozer chimes in to calm Deacon down and confronts him on what he thinks is going through his head, having thoughts about visiting the refugee camp that Sarah died at. Deacon's dismissive of Boozer's support, and they continue through the tunnel. The two head off to the pit stop, and Deacon has a plan to loot the place. Boozer will distract the infected by driving by to get their attention, while Deke heads in on foot to clean up and find the part that they need. It goes pretty well. We get introduced to some infected and learn how to fight and sneak, and Deacon finds the spare part that he was looking for. Until Boozer radios Deacon saying that he's been caught by some Rippers, shorthand for members in the Rest in Peace cult, a local gang that's welcomed the apocalypse with open arms and open wounds. Deacon rushes out to the highway to find Boozer, but we're a little late. Boozer is being held down and tortured by the Rippers, burning his tattoos off of his arm with a propane torch. Deacon kills the Rippers and approaches Boozer, clearly severely wounded from the attack and too weak to stand. A horde begins to approach the boys from behind, and they narrowly escape on Boozer's bike. The bikers get back to their hideout, a firewatch tower at the top of a mountain in the Cascade Forest. Boozer's not looking so hot, so Deacon gets him in a bed and heads out to find some medicine to treat his arm. We run down the mountain, and Deacon heads back to where he left his bike, finding that the bike is missing and noticing a man nearby watching him. Deacon chases the man all the way back to a nearby settlement, Copeland's Camp, a work camp run under martial law by the titular Copeland. Deacon confronts Copeland about his men stripping his bike, and Cope says that he can provide Deacon with some spare parts if he's willing to do some work for him, specifically getting a radio tower back up and running so Copeland can start broadcasting his radio show again. Copeland's show, Radio Free Oregon, is schizo-posting to the max. He rambles on about conspiracies about the outbreak, his beliefs about how people should conduct themselves in the apocalypse, and complains about the federal government, all thanks to Deacon putting him back on the radio waves. When we're tuning into his show, Deacon usually has a little bit of feedback for Copeland that he shouts out to the wilderness while he rides around. It's a bit of a silly back and forth, and it at least shows that Deacon hasn't fallen into some radicalized way of thinking while he's been drifting around for the last 2 years, still holding on to some common sense and rational thought. With the radio tower back online and with a new motorcycle, Deacon heads to a Nero checkpoint, quarantine zone set up by the National Emergency Response Organization, or NERO for short. Deacon finds some sterile bandages for Boozer in a mobile medical station, as well as some steroids he decides to inject himself with. You think these expire or something? Comment below if you'd inject yourself with an unfamiliar 2-year-old mystery serum. I think I would. Anyways, with the bandages in hand, we head back to check on Boozer and patch him up. Approaching the base, Boozer is on edge when he's woken up, pointing his gun at Deacon and aggressively taking the bandages from him, refusing his help to treat the wound. Let's take a second to talk about Deacon St. John. So far, we've gotten a pretty unstable picture of a man. Deke constantly talks to himself, he relishes in the pain of enemies around him, and is constantly fumbling words out of his mouth when he's speaking to anyone. He's clearly gone a bit off the deep end out here in the shit, which is what people refer to the wilderness as throughout the game, and I think that makes him a pretty interesting character as a protagonist. He's clearly mentally unwell, and through some dialogue with Boozer and others, very obviously in a deep depression after what happened to Sarah, while potentially being suicidal, which is further suggested by Boozer stating Deacon has a death wish multiple times throughout the game. The core of the narrative here in Days Gone is the redemption of Deacon, not so much through his actions and character, but his acceptance of what's happened to him and what keeps him going in this new world. I like Deacon a lot. I think his arc works well, which we'll see more of as we continue, but even now, I think he's a unique character for a game. We aren't often put in the shoes of a homicidal maniac that outwardly shows they're affected by what they've done and what's been done to them. Back to the story, Deacon decides to pick up the drug stash that he was chasing Leon for in the opening. Once we find it, as Deacon brings the stash back to his bike, we see a military helicopter fly overhead. Deacon decides to follow the helicopter to see what they're up to, continuing further to eavesdrop on their soldiers and researchers once they've landed. While listening in, we overhear the name O'Brien, the same name of the man that helped Sarah get out of the city when the outbreak started. We also get a little more info about the freaks. Apparently they like to hibernate at night and choose to do so in caves or otherwise enclosed spots. We'll get some more info about the freaks periodically throughout the game, which I think helps them stand out a bit from your run-of-the-mill zombie. But with the name O'Brien, Deacon begins spiraling a bit about the chance of Sarah still being alive, radioing Boozer with the news, who isn't very happy to hear Deke going on about his dead wife yet again. But with Leon's drug stash and proof of kill in tow, we head off to cash in the bounty to our employers, another settlement in the area, the Hot Springs Camp, run by Ada Tucker, a kind-looking old woman that works her people to the bone in a prison camp. Deacon cashes in the bounty for Leon, and Tucker asks Deke to take on another job. Apparently someone has been spotted snooping around the camp at night, and Tucker wants to know who. Deacon heads over to the local arms dealer, who tells Deke that one of his men was tortured by some rippers, and the strangest thing about it was they were asking about 2 bikers, specifically asking about mongrels. Deacon is dismissive of the warning and heads off to find the person that's been creeping around the work camp. Before we head off to find the peeping Tom though, Deke wants to visit a memorial that he has for Sarah at the old refugee camp. Riding up to do so, we get the first flashback of the game, showing us a little bit more of the initial outbreak and that final night with Sarah. I really dislike this flashback. I think it's redundant to the opening of the game, which should have just been this cutscene, showing more context of the outbreak from the beginning. In this extended look of the outbreak, we see how Sarah gets wounded, more of Boozer and Deke's relationship and trust of each other, and some really fun shots showing how scary the initial onset of freaks must have been. We also see Deacon's first human kill in the apocalypse. He made it a couple hours before he started shooting people. Nice. And yeah, I think all of this would have been pretty good setup for the character we'll be playing as a few hours before we see it here. I wouldn't be surprised if this extended outbreak cutscene was originally the opening of the game and was shifted around to get into the action quicker, or maybe pad out this memorial visit. And I think introducing the information about O'Brien's name would have been more relevant now, since that's the major plot thread we're following, but I do understand getting that name to the player at the very beginning for the potential aha moment when you hear the name for yourself. Overall, I think its worst offense here is again the redundancy of what we just saw a few hours ago in the opening of the game. I would mind this cutscene a lot less if half of it wasn't things we'd already seen and already know about. Thankfully, another Nero helicopter is here to snap us back to reality, and we chase this one down too. At their landing zone, we see the Nero personnel trying to wrangle a newt, an infected child. More on special infected types later. Their attempt is cut short when they're overrun by a horde and barely make it out to their chopper. The horde follows, and Deacon heads in to see if Nero left anything behind in the commotion. And they did. They left behind a radio, which a newt tried to steal, and I promptly opted out of chasing him.
Shit, that's mine! Finally. Jesus Christ, those shits can run fast.
With the radio and some more delusion over his dead wife, Deacon reflects on another memory with Sarah. This time, it's a memory of the first time that they met. Sarah's car had broken down on the side of the highway, and Deacon pretends to be a lost traveler rolling up on his bike. I like seeing this side of Deke. He was a goofy guy with a sense of humor before the outbreak, and we see a lot of that in the flashbacks, which is a stark contrast to the Deacon we play as, the on-edge, paranoid, borderline psycho. Deacon offers Sarah a ride into town, and they chat a bit until a truck comes barreling down the road towards them, Deacon barely maneuvering out of the way. Nothing quite like a near-death experience to fall in love with someone. Sarah gets a phone call and is asked to stay with her car for a service vehicle to arrive. And when we get back to it, the fellas from the truck are poking around the inside of her car. Deacon tries to fight the men off, but gets beat up pretty thoroughly until Sarah finds a gun in his bag and fires it off to scare the men. Nothing quite like an unlawful discharge to fall in love with someone. The two chat a bit more, and Deacon stays with Sarah until her car is serviced. Deacon then tracks down the person that's been spotted near Hot Springs Camp, and finds a teenage girl, Lisa, who's been surviving in the apocalypse by herself for the last 2 years, which has clearly taken a heavy toll on her mental stability. Deacon offers to take the girl back to Hot Springs Camp, convincing her that her mother might be at the camp, which is an obvious lie, but Lisa is too far gone to realize. Returning to the camp, Lisa and Tucker, again the leader of the camp, recognize each other, being neighbors from before the outbreak. Tucker plays up her sweet old lady facade for Lisa, and when Deacon asks Tucker to go easy on her, the act is dropped quickly, unfortunately placing Lisa in a not-so-friendly new home. While riding through the Cascade region, Deacon overhears O'Brien on his Nero radio and sees a helicopter he's likely on landing nearby. What a coincidence. Deacon decides to follow the chopper and confront O'Brien once he's landed, catching him off guard and threatening him for information on how he survived at the refugee camp that Sarah died at. Turns out, Sarah and O'Brien never made it to that overrun camp, instead getting diverted to another camp in Silver Lake. O'Brien offers to look at the records to see if Sarah survived the stabbing we saw in the opening, and Deacon reluctantly agrees to work with him to get that information. We get a quick intermission from Drifting to check in on Lisa, and she doesn't seem very happy, telling Deke they won't let her leave and they're keeping her on a pretty strict work schedule. Deacon finally opens up to us, the player and Boozer, why he's taken an interest in Lisa. She reminds him of Sarah's little sister and is struggling with seeing a kid like that in this new world. So, Deacon asks Boozer if he knows where he could track down a Thunder Egg, or a geode, to cheer up Lisa since she told Deke about her parents being mineral enthusiasts before the outbreak. Unfortunately, a shiny rock isn't a great substitute for dead parents, and being forced into manual labor, who knew? So Lisa isn't too excited about the gift, and she even begs Deacon to take her back to where he found her. Deke turns her down, and Lisa leaves to get some sleep before her next shift. When we next check in with Boozer, it's clear he's suffering from a bad fever, which leads Deacon to reflecting on something Sarah taught him. We get a flashback of a hiking date between the two, with Sarah having Deke pick some lavender for an herbal remedy she wants to make. Sarah tries to go swimming in a lake nearby, but Deacon shuts down the idea, clearly hiding something from her. We'll get an explanation for what was going on here much later in the game. You can just keep it in the back of your head that Deke isn't a big fan of bodies of water. With the flashback over, Deke gets the idea to scrounge up some lavender for Boozer to make that herbal remedy, so we head out to find some flowers and return with the salve. Boozer is increasingly frustrated with being bedridden and partially disabled. We see this physically with him struggling to load his shotgun, and he berates and snaps at Deacon verbally. Deke's pretty understanding with his frustration, so we leave Boozer to treat his wound himself. Shortly after this visit, Tucker radios in that the Hot Springs camp has been hit by Rippers, kidnapping a few women including Lisa. Tucker wants Deke to track down the Rippers to see if he can rescue the hostages since her men aren't available to be on the offensive. We track down the Rippers and fight through the camp, finding Lisa as the only survivor from the kidnapped group. It's very clear that she's been physically tortured, with new wounds all over her body and distant, detached emotions coming from her while we get her out of the Ripper camp. When we finally reach our bike, Deacon offers to take Lisa to a nicer, safer camp that's a bit out of the way. Contacting the camp, we hear from Ricky, an old friend of Deacon who isn't too pleased to hear from him, bringing up some history between Deacon and some members of her group. Deke explains that he doesn't want anything from her or the Lost Lake camp, but he has a kid with him and he wants Lisa to have a safe place. So Ricky agrees to meet to take Lisa back to camp with her. Meeting with Ricky, there's some clear tension and history between her and Deke, but they're both focused on helping Lisa in the moment, and Ricky takes her back to Lost Lake. Following the drop-off, we have the option to reflect on what's been going on with Lisa at Sarah's memorial, further implying that Deacon is projecting his perception of Sarah's sister onto Lisa and explaining his need to help her. I don't think I've mentioned the optional memorial visits yet, so with this one, I guess it's a good time to bring them up. Throughout the story, you'll get prompted to new missions at Sarah's memorial, which are usually pretty far out of the way for you to trek back to, assuming you don't fast travel like I did since I was on a specific difficulty. More about that later. Anyways, these side missions are opportunities for us to peek inside Deacon's head. He most clearly expresses himself and what he's thinking when he's speaking to Sarah, or at least pretending to talk to her. I like these a lot. They add some depth to Deacon as a character and give us a chance to see what's going on if you're somehow missing the subtext of his presentation to people or outright ignoring some exposition. These optional visits to the memorial come up frequently throughout the game, usually after a big plot point is revealed or progressing, like meeting O'Brien for the first time, but I do think they can be a bit redundant with the information we hear or see through main missions. Obviously, these are optional objectives, so Deacon repeating himself or restating how he's feeling isn't forced onto the player, but I do wish that some of these memorial visits dove a little deeper into what he was thinking instead of just restating what we've already learned, like talking about Lisa being a reminder of Sarah's sister, which we already heard when he told Boozer. I think there being a willingness to withhold information in the main missions for reveals at these memorial visits could have gone a long way in characterizing Deacon in a more meaningful way with these visits, but I do understand the desire to keep important exposition and information in the main line of missions. However, I also think that in the game where the main character is depressed about his dead wife, you can expect players that care about the story to check in with that dead wife when they're offered the chance. I know games are expected to be written in a way that allow people to essentially ignore the narrative if they just want to shoot stuff, but that doesn't mean you can't take a chance on the people that are paying attention. Following the drop-off and some more side missions for Tucker and Copeland, Deacon decides to lie down and rest back at the base for once. He's woken up by Boozer having a full-on hallucination induced by his fever, waving his shotgun around the watchtower and even shooting a hole in the ceiling when Deacon tries to calm him down and take the gun. Deacon points out that Boozer is clearly suffering from blood poisoning. His fever and injuries are getting worse. Deke decides it's finally time to get some more serious treatment involved to help Boozer, deciding on riding out together to Lost Lake Camp to steal some medical supplies for him. This ride down south to a new region of the map for a player and the return of Deke and Boozer to Lost Lake is accompanied by a needle drop moment, or a moment with a specific song to enhance a sequence in a game. The song here being Soldier's Eyes by Jack Savaretti. I have two things to say about the inclusion of this song at this moment. The first being that the moment feels very forced and hasn't exactly been earned by the narrative at this point, in my opinion. The most we've seen about Boozer has been a bedridden sidekick that's upset about his injury, understandably so, but we haven't got much depth out of him or our relationship with him, so this emotional ride back to somewhere we aren't welcome doesn't exactly land for me yet. The second thing about this moment is the use of that specific song and why I think it was chosen. I like the song quite a bit, but I honestly don't think the song has anything to do with their situation right now. From what I can glean, the song seems to be about coming home after something traumatic, in the song's case, probably a literal deployment in war, which has changed their perspective of the world to a darker, more bleak outlook. That hasn't really happened to Boozer and Deacon in what we've seen. They've been out in the apocalypse for a while, and they were with Lost Lake during the apocalypse, but we haven't had any indication that they've changed how they view things or how they operate out here since we've taken control. Again, like the song would imply, a change in their perspective. You could argue that Deacon's perspective has shifted with Boozer's declining health and mental state, but again, we haven't really seen much else of Boozer and their relationship, so this is all we know as the player. Additionally, while writing, Deacon talks about the initial outbreak and when he saw how everyone turned on each other or got turned into freaks, saying that when you see something like that, you know your time to go is just inevitable, which does play into another theme of the song being not knowing what to do after that shift in your perspective. Boozer and Deacon continue to talk about why they're still out here surviving and why they continue to go on, landing on what the hell else are we supposed to do, which I think is actually a contrast to the point of the song, where the song is saying that they've had this change in their outlook but they are coming home, they have something to come home to, but here Deacon is essentially saying that they have nothing. I would appreciate this song a little later in the game because I think it would land better after some growth from Deacon that we see later, but maybe I'll bring it back up then. I've been complaining about this for way too long. Before I wrap it up though, the real reason I think this song was ultimately chosen was because it was in Sons of Anarchy, a fictional show focused around biker culture which John Garvin, the creative director and writer of Days Gone, has expressly stated was an inspiration for the game as a whole. I understand liking something, a song or a show, and wanting to include some homage or reference to it in something you create. But man, this moment just feels really forced, and again, I don't think it's been earned. There's another sequence like this later in the game, and I think that song both fits thematically with the story, and the narrative has reached a point where we've earned a thoughtful reflection that is accompanied with a song, but we'll dig into that one later. Okay, complaining over for now. Back to the story at hand. Arriving at Lost Lake, Deacon decides the best idea here would be to sneak into the camp and steal supplies for Boozer, since Iron Mike, the leader of the camp, said that if he ever saw Deacon again, he'd kill him. Deacon manages to sneak through the camp and into the infirmary, grabbing some antibiotics for Boozer but being caught by Ricky, the woman we met earlier, and Addie, the camp doctor. The women check to see what Deacon's stolen, seeing that it's only antibiotics, so clearly Deacon has some intent past personal gain. The women tell Deke to bring Boozer in, since if he needs these antibiotics, he clearly needs some serious medical help as well. Ricky heads off with Deacon to pick up Boozer, and Deke asks about how Lisa has been doing in the camp since she was dropped off. Ricky reveals that Lisa hasn't been seen around camp for days. She joined a scavenging run and didn't return with the rest of the group. Riding up to Boozer, he's looking worse than ever, but we get him back to the infirmary in camp. Ricky walks Deacon up to talk to Iron Mike, again the leader of Lost Lake Camp, and the two talk about Mike's current deal with the Rippers, an agreement of peace between Mike's people and the Ripper camp. Reaching Mike's office, we see Skizzo, the head of security for the camp, talking to Mike about the biker boys' arrival and trying to instill distrust before they can speak for themselves. Ricky and Deacon convince Mike that they should stick around if Deacon can help out around the camp and if Boozer can pull his weight once he's better. Mike wants to talk to Deacon, so they walk around camp together, and Mike lectures Deke on him and Boozer drifting, a term used for people that don't settle down in camps. Mike suggests that the two need to settle down and find their people and work towards a bigger picture rather than just surviving. Following our warm welcome into camp, Deacon decides to make himself useful and picks up a shopping list from Addie for supplies in the infirmary, specifically requesting a listed knife for field surgery. While on the road, O'Brien finally reaches back out to Deacon over his Nero radio, asking Deke to do something for him before he can give info on Sarah, requesting to meet to go over the details. Meeting with O'Brien, he seems pretty on edge with some infighting going on with Nero personnel. He also reveals that he hasn't dug up anything on Sarah yet, but he's trying and will continue to poke around if Deacon is willing to help O'Brien spy on other Nero task force out in the field. This leads us into a series of missions throughout the next few hours of the game where we sneak into Nero landing zones like we have done before, plant a tracker on their helicopter, and listen in on conversations for O'Brien to track and record what the other groups are doing. For the player's part, this is a bunch of mandatory exposition dumps about the freaks. Unfortunately, they are kind of important to the grand scheme of things, but to keep it brief and contained here instead of stopping every time we go spy on Nero, what we need to know is this. 1. The freaks are evolving and getting freakier. 2. The freaks have more human-like, intelligent tendencies than expected, like maintaining personal belongings and having a somewhat balanced diet. And lastly, 3, the initial virus seems to be more of a forced evolution for human DNA rather than a pathogen to kill everyone. Obviously, that's a lot of info to take in for our infected friends, and these points are important to keep in mind for the overall plot, but again, I think breaking the flow of my retelling every time we spy on Nero would have been more disruptive than getting all the info out here. Between Nero espionage runs, Deacon decides to search for Lisa himself, heading to where her scavenging party was looting. There, Deacon finds a note written by Lisa. I don't really know how Deacon can tell it's her handwriting, other than the sake of plot convenience, but the note clearly indicates that Lisa has been severely traumatized by her encounter with the Rippers, scratching in their insignias and symbols and begging to forget what happened in the writing. Visiting Boozer in the infirmary, things are not looking good. Boozer is seizing up from infection and clearly not still lucid when he's not physically going through it. Skizzo happens to be listening in and invites Deacon in on a plan to raid a crashed medical aircraft over in Iron Butte, in Ripper territory. Deke is hesitant to go against Mike's treaty with the Rippers, but Skizzo leads him on to pursue the medicine and steal it out from under them. So, Deacon heads across the Ripper border late at night, fighting his way through a checkpoint and heading over to the plane crash. At the crash, we get our first look at a new freak. One of those further mutations are Nero Intel mentioned earlier. Here we meet the Breaker, the game's big, bulky, muscle head infected. We'll talk more about them later, but he's here to drive home the point on worse mutations starting to pop up. With the Breaker dead, we secure the medical supplies and begin our ride back over to Lost Lake. As we cross the border, Rippers finally notice us and chase Deacon out of their territory with Skizzo and his men holding them back. Ricky rides up to the checkpoint and asks Deacon to come back to the infirmary to check on Boozer. On the ride back, Ricky reminds Deke about the treaty with the camps, specifically mentioning the medicine and Mike's plan to split the stash with the Rippers. Deacon suggests that the Rippers have been secretly looting the stash the whole time, but Ricky isn't listening. Reaching the infirmary, Boozer is going into shock and needs to have his arm amputated before the infection spreads from the arm. Deacon and Boozer initially protest, but Addie says it's the arm or his life. Thankfully, we just brought Addie a knife to saw his arm off a little bit ago, so she gets hacking and the arm comes right off. Right when the operation is through, Mike confronts Deacon about trespassing into Ripper territory, saying Deacon is putting other people in harm's way for his own personal gain, with a line that goes way too hard.
You are writing checks with other men's blood!
Following the amputation, Deacon decides to reflect at Sarah's memorial. Deacon feels directly responsible for everything that's happened to Boozer, the injury, the amputation, and their situation with being back at Lost Lake. Deacon also talks about the kind of people he thinks would have survived this far, how anyone that had a cushy, normal life probably didn't make it past the first few weeks, and that anyone that's left was a drug addict, ex-con, or worse because they'd have what it takes to survive out here, with Deacon ending that he's ultimately grateful that Sarah didn't live to see how bad things have gotten. Returning to Lost Lake, Deacon wants to speak to Mike. Deke wants to do something big for the camp for what they've been doing for Boozer, asking Mike to join him on a hike to see a nearby migrating horde. Deacon flexes his latest Nero knowledge to imply that the freaks seem to be migrating between nests, even going hundreds of miles to find a new place to nest. Deacon suggests a plan to blow up the local caves, where freaks tend to nest, to give them less options in the valley and to potentially prevent more freaks from settling in the area. Mike is on board and helps get the next step of the plan in motion, pointing us towards where to find some dynamite to be able to block off the cave systems. So they both mount up and head over to Sherman's camp, a nearby town overrun with freaks. Mike knows that before the outbreak, the local mines would have had to document their equipment with the county government, so the government building in town should have some information on where they can track down some dynamite. Pushing through Sherman's camp, Mike seems to have some ulterior motives with bringing Deacon along, bringing us to a preschool full of rotting corpses. Mike fills us in that he was part of a group that was here, and in this building everyone fought and killed each other until only two survivors, him and another woman, walked out. Mike tells Deacon about what happened, clearly still affected by what happened in Sherman's camp, which is what fuels his intentions with the Rippers, his attempts at keeping peace. The men secure the maps to show where the dynamite is stored throughout the county and are ambushed by some bandits, with Mike reluctantly on board with having to kill them. Getting back to the camp, Mike wants to impose his wisdom on Deacon one last time, saying that once the freaks are gone, if they ever are, the people left will have to pick up the pieces and what they did during the apocalypse will have mattered. We have a quick post-op visit with Boozer, and he's surprisingly in good spirits about missing his arm. It might be a bit of denial and reluctant coping with humor, but all in all, he seems to be in a better mood than the Boozer we have seen throughout the game. Addie wants to remind Deacon that without the operation, Boozer would have died, but Deacon can't let go of the fact that he feels responsible for Boozer being in this position to begin with. Walking around the camp, Ricky finds us and asks for some help heading out into the shit, asking Deacon to join her on a ride to a nearby hydroelectric dam. Ricky thinks that if she can get the dam up and running, she can restore power to the area and help bring Lost Lake back on the grid. Along the way to the dam, Ricky and Deacon talk a bit about their past and learn some more about each other, apparently not talking to each other very much when they previously ran together before she settled down at Lost Lake Camp. While they talk, Ricky comments on Deacon Boozer's lifestyle, the drifting they do, and says that she's moved on from that and wants to settle down with something like Lost Lake, further suggesting that maybe Deacon should consider the same. Arriving at the dam, things look pretty good. Everything is still in good condition, but there is a blockage in the water flow preventing the turbines from providing any power. Ricky quickly dives into the lake and clears the blockage, and we head into the interior of the dam to make sure everything below ground is running smoothly. The two continue to talk about their past leading up through the apocalypse, with Ricky opening up about her family and mentioning that she doesn't know what happened to them since she wasn't home when the outbreak started. Ricky tries to get some similar dialogue out of Deacon, and he's pretty tight-lipped. But she does confront Deke to tell him why she decided to leave him and Boozer behind. Ricky recalls the exact night she decided to stop drifting. A quiet night between the three of them where Deacon stayed up for hours staring at a photo of Sarah. In that moment, Ricky knew that she wanted to look forward instead of dwelling on the past and letting it consume her, pushing her towards camp life with Iron Mike. Deacon is in denial of this assessment from Ricky, but the two are interrupted by Rippers approaching to attack. Ricky tries to talk them down, but it's clear they're here to fight, showing Ricky the Rippers' true intentions when they're not putting on a show for Iron Mike. Following the Ripper encounter, Ricky notices a piece of cardboard with a drawing of the Mongrel's emblem, the one that Deacon and Boozer still wear. During the ride home, Deacon finally opens up a bit more to Ricky, telling her about why he ended up in the Mongrels Club. Deacon is a veteran from a deployment in Afghanistan, a deployment that left him with extreme trauma from an enemy ambush that saw his squad and their vehicle blown into the Hari River. Deacon was the only survivor, confirming that himself when he pulled the rest of his squad out of the river one by one. When he came back from his deployment, he wandered the states on a motorcycle until he settled down at a mechanic shop run by Jack, the former president of the Mongrels who personally invited Deacon into the club. Aside from the flashbacks with Sarah, this is the first time that we get any opening up from Deacon to see more about his character, and I think it explains a lot about him. Aside from the more obvious stuff with his potential trauma response to bodies of water, which explains why he might have been hesitant to swim with Sarah, it also gives us some exposition on why he and Boozer still represent the Mongols when the motorcycle club is long gone. A couple of characters ask Deacon why he still wears his vest, or as they say, why he still flies colors, and Deacon doesn't usually respond with much, saying he doesn't know or ignoring the question outright. But I think it's clear through this interaction with Ricky, the Mongrels gave Deacon, and likely Boozer, a sense of purpose and family in the world when they needed it, and by wearing the Mongrels emblem today, they can still have that with each other. Deacon is a kind and compassionate person as a whole. We can see that with his willingness to help people in need, less so when he's taunting the people he kills, but mostly, Deacon is loyal to the people he cares about, and I think this conversation with Ricky, along with the earlier talk about being stuck in his past, clearly conveys that to the player. Along the way home, we see a power line that has gone down and needs some repairs, but Ricky isn't concerned with it right now. Instead, she wants to show Deacon something. That something being a massive horde gathering in a lumberyard close to Lost Lake Camp. This is easily the biggest horde we've seen in-game, and Deacon expresses that it's the biggest he's seen himself. The two continue to ride home, and Addie greets Ricky at the gate, worried about where she's been. We take a brief detour back to the biker's old hideout, the Firewatch Tower, to retrieve Boozer's bike for him since we had to leave it to rush him down to Lost Lake. Boozer is appreciative of the gesture, but disappointed he can't ride anymore. Which I guess makes a good time for a tangent to talk about Boozer and a big problem I have with his character. I like Boozer. He seems like a great best friend to have at the end of the world. He's loyal to a fault, he's got a good sense of humor, and just a good guy to be around, and that's expressed through a lot of characters in game. A lot of people really like Boozer and worry about him when they hear that he's injured. Which makes me wonder who on the development team really hated Boozer or didn't care to develop him properly. Throughout the game, the first bit of characterization we really see from Boozer isn't very kind to him. He's rude to Deacon and dismissive of his concern, and throughout gameplay he frequently radios Deke and the player to complain about his inability to be out on the road with Deke, which to me just kind of sets up the player to dislike Boozer. We don't get very much time with him before the injury, and after it, while he's clearly not himself, he's very hostile towards Deacon and complains in the player's ear for the first 15 hours of gameplay. And while Boozer is much more likable and personable in the second act of the game, after he loses his forearm, the game treats him so poorly that I swear someone at Ben's studio has to have some vendetta against amputees. After Boozer's operation, Boozer is treated like he's entirely useless and pathetic. He's relegated to working the field and treated like he can't do anything physical anymore. And while I understand that there would be a large learning curve for him physically, and that a large portion of the rest of his storyline is helping him overcome his own personal mental struggle with his new disability, I really don't think he needed to be treated the way he was. A guy with an arm and a half can still shoot a gun, he can probably steer a bike, and we can see that Boozer can still handle himself physically in a fight later. So why does the game go through so many motions to treat Boozer like he's not capable of anything anymore? We even end up helping Ricky make Boozer a prosthetic arm with a blade, and he has a more casual hook prosthetic when he isn't in fight mode, again potentially enabling him to learn how to ride his bike and use firearms with his new prosthetic. Or they could have made him custom handlebars, or literally anything else instead of having him mope around for the next 10 hours. I really don't like how Boozer is forced into the back seat in the middle part of the game, and I don't think he's given the proper chance to shine as a character with the storyline presented here. Again, I like Boozer, I can see the kind of guy he is behind the wall of shame written for him as a fresh amputee, but we don't get to see much of the real him because he's relegated to a distraction for Deacon during the second act of the game. There's still some story here with Boozer that we'll be going over, so hopefully you'll see my point and why I feel that Boozer is underused and mistreated going forward. And following the bike retrieval, here's a quick cutscene with Addie to hammer this point home. She asks us to keep a closer eye on Boozer since losing that arm will be forcing him to give up the life he's known. And on top of that, immediately following this cutscene, we're forced to go visit Boozer at Lost Lake's farm where he's raking dirt and clearly annoyed. It's one of the most awkward interactions in the game. It's an entire story mission to see Boozer struggle with raking a field and sounding sad about doing so, and then you get a pat on the back with a mission completion screen. It's just really weird to me. Following the Boozer intermission, we meet up with Skizzo and Iron Mike to go over the map for dynamite that we retrieved. Apparently, the nearest mining operation that should have explosives is known to be dangerous. A recent scavenging team went to loot the place and did not come back. Deacon offers to try and retrieve the dynamite, but Schizo doesn't trust Deacon to go alone, insisting on coming with him. The two reach the mine, and throughout gameplay during this mission, it's clearly implied and insisted on that Schizo is lazy and incompetent, and especially shown that he shouldn't be trusted, or at least would be hard to trust. He doesn't have a flashlight, he forces Deacon to go into dangerous situations on his own, and he directly ignores Deacon's advice to avoid using a gun in an enclosed space to avoid freak attention. We'll see more of Schizo throughout the story, but I think this mission is meant to really cement the idea of his character, a sleazy guy that does the bare minimum and expects everyone else to pick up the slack. Otherwise, for this mission, just a quick side note from me, I really like how it looks. Schizo's lack of a flashlight forces him to carry some flares and drop them throughout the mine, and it looks great. It really creates a unique and foreboding ambience in this long, claustrophobic search. Anyways, the men find the explosives they're looking for and promptly leave the mine until they're flanked by bandits. The bandits are quickly taken care of, and Schizo has a piece to say to Deacon. Schizo confesses to Deacon that he wants to overthrow Iron Mike, saying that he thinks he and Deacon are on the same page about what it takes to survive, and even suggests that Deacon should run the camp alongside him once they take out Mike. Deacon immediately turns Schizo down, saying that he would not resort to stabbing a friend in the back like that. When we get back to camp, we learn that Boozer hasn't been seen in a while, with Schizo letting him leave the camp alone with a bottle of whiskey. What precedes is a needlessly long mission with some awful dialogue from Boozer while he's drunk. I don't really care for drunk writing in media. I don't think it's ever conveyed or acted very well, and Days Gone is no exception here. But this mission does give us a little more meat from Deacon Boozer's relationship. When we finally track him down, he's walking down the highway and trying to get himself killed by a horde of freaks. Deacon stands with him, saying that if this is how they're going to die, then so be it. When Boozer's wife died before the outbreak, Deacon found him trying to drink himself to death, and decided to sit down and join him if that's what Boozer was deciding, because they're brothers to each other and will go out together if nothing else. When Deacon tries to play this card again here in front of the horde, Boozer backs off again and decides to head home with Deke, accepting that he still has a life to live alongside his brother. I like this moment between them. It's clear that they're reliant on each other in the apocalypse with no one else to lean on, and this really puts that to the test. I don't think if one of them died, the other one would take their own life, but if one of them gives up, the other one has to be there to help him get back to his feet. It's a mostly unspoken rule between them throughout the game, and we can see that it's been a large reason that Deacon's carried on the last 2 years, even establishing this in the opening scene now that we're seeing it's the case for Boozer as well. On the ride home, we get this rule between them strengthened further, with Deacon admitting that without Boozer, he would have been dead a long time ago. Once we're home, Deke brings up the idea to give Boozer a new prosthetic, the blade arm I mentioned previously. We get the new arm fitted for Boozer, and he seems excited about it. Maybe a little too excited. Finally, we hear from O'Brien again, calling to ask Deacon for one last favor, but Deke is tired of running around for him until O'Brien mentions Sarah's middle name, saying that he found her admission form, so he has some new information for Deacon. Boozer catches Deke on the way out to meet O'Brien and decides to tag along for this last job and meeting. On the way, Boozer talks about how much he misses being out on the road and appreciates Deacon taking him along, even if he's stuck on the back of a bike. While we're out, we eavesdrop on another Nero researcher, plant a bug on another helicopter, and head out to meet O'Brien. Deacon decides to approach him alone to make sure he isn't scared off, and it turns out O'Brien has been digging around for us. He has the admission form he mentioned, and according to the medical records, she made a full recovery from the stab on the night of the outbreak. Unfortunately, the camp she was at was still overrun, only taking Nero personnel and federal-level employees in the evacuation. Deacon struggles with the hopes of Sarah being alive taken from him again, and O'Brien tries to comfort him in the fact that he still saved her life that night they separated, and that instead of dying with her, he's still alive. Deacon ends the meeting with thanking O'Brien for saving her life that night and heads off to meet back with Boozer. Unfortunately, Boozer got impatient and wandered off towards a nearby campsite, ripping apart some rippers that were hunting down and killing dogs. Not wolves, but loose domesticated animals. Deacon finds Boozer trying to comfort a wounded dog and helps him put the dog down mercifully instead of letting it bleed out. Boozer then runs to face the rippers responsible for this head on, and we fight through them together. Again, showing that Boozer still has plenty of fight in him, but he's written in a way to seem useless. Getting back to Deke's bike, Boozer wants to know how the meeting with O'Brien went. Deacon's clearly back in denial about Sarah's death, refusing to tell Boozer what he just learned, and resulting in a physical fight between the two, again showing that Boozer is still physically capable here with a missing arm. Boozer thoroughly beats Deacon and yells at him for what he's been trying to say to him for 2 years, asking if Deacon has finally mourned her enough now that he's confirmed that she's dead. And a lot of people ask Deacon this. Anyone that's known he's still stuck on his wife's death asks him, hasn't he mourned long enough? And Deacon never really seems to have a good answer for this, instead brushing off the question or ignoring their concern like he does with most people taking an interest with him. Unfortunately, even here with his best friend, he derails the conversation with a joke, and Boozer can tell he's been worked up enough in this moment, so we move on. Following the news about Sarah, Deacon decides that it is time for him to move on and heal. Deciding to visit the church, he and Sarah got married in to confront his emotions head on. Arriving at the church though, it's being torn apart by bandits and raided for supplies, leading Deacon to killing all the men inside and burning the church down in his frustration. While we fight through the bandits, we cut back and forth to the memory of Deacon and Sarah's wedding. It's an awkward ceremony, clearly not traditional for the minister they've hired to ordain it, and we quickly see why. It looks like Deacon and Sarah have decided to elope, with only Boozer attending the wedding between both of their family and friends. Through her vows, Sarah expresses that she would have given up anything for Deacon and their love. Deacon vows to always love Sarah and to never leave her, and Sarah has one final gesture to return his mongrel ring back to Deacon, but only
if you promise to ride me as much as you ride your bike.
Yeah, out of context, that's pretty bad and it's easy to laugh at. But let's cheat a little bit and look at the context for this line here and in another flashback a few hours after this. Obviously, through their vows in this cutscene, the two have given up a lot to be here. Sarah has seemingly lost the approval of her family with her love for Deacon, and the same might go for Deke and the mongrels with their absence as well. So I think this line is one thing mainly, Sarah giving into that MC lifestyle that Deacon has and accepting him for the person he is, while teasing him like they often do to each other. And this is where I'm cheating a bit, this is further bolstered by the flashback later in the game. When Deacon proposes to Sarah on a midnight hike, he gives her his mongrel ring and accepts his proposal on the terms that they do not have a biker wedding, where he says he'll ride her like he rides his bike. So this is clearly a sweet joke between the two, on top of the sentimentality that comes with the overall gesture of their coming together. But yeah, I guess it makes for a pretty funny Twitter clip to laugh at the game you didn't actually play. On the way back into Lost Lake Camp, Ricky catches us to help her get that broken power line back up and running. We ride out to the line and defend her while she repairs it, and returning home, everyone gathers for a big announcement from Iron Mike. Mike gives a speech focused on trust and hope for the future, trust in each other and hope that we can rebuild. He gives a special thanks to Deacon helping Ricky's efforts, and with a dramatic pause, Ricky flips the switch to restore power to Lost Lake Camp. It's a nice and warm moment for the camp in an otherwise depressing world. Ricky notices a minor wound on Deacon's stomach and offers to treat it since Addie isn't around. Deacon and Ricky share an intimate moment, and Ricky notices all of the scars along Deacon's body, slowly guiding her hand along them and asking about each while getting closer. We see Skizzo watching the moment from outside, but then Deacon silently turns down Ricky's advances, and she's pretty understanding of it, having heard about Deacon's recent discovery with Sarah. Before they part though, Ricky tells Deacon he should try settling down to light a candle, because things will get cold and dark on your own out there. Addie speaks to Deacon the next morning to suggest to him that Boozer needs something to heal his soul, not just his body, suggesting that he finds a dog for him since he was clearly affected by the Rippers hunting them down. So we go and find a dog, a Norwegian Elkhound puppy. Boozer seems pretty excited about his new friend, even naming him Jack after the mongrel's president. Finally, getting back to our plan to blow up the Freak Caves, Skizzo reaches out about where to find some detonation cords for the dynamite we already acquired. Apparently, the closest and easiest place to find some is deep inside Ripper territory, back up in Iron Butte. The two head out to sneak into the region, climbing over an old hiking route on foot and make their way to an old mining facility. Through this mission, we again get to see how little regard Skizzo has for Deacon's safety by sending him into a newt nest to clear a path by himself. On the way out of the storage building, Skizzo takes Deacon's sidearm and knocks him unconscious as we hear Rippers approach on motorcycles. When Deacon comes to, we're being held in a Ripper building, clearly shown by the writing on the walls and the overall state of the room. Eventually, a Ripper enters, Mr. Ripper himself, Carlos. We've heard his name a few times in a couple of conversations, but instead of Carlos, Deacon knows him as Jesse Williamson, a former member of the Mongrels MC. Carlos monologues to Deacon about his memory about how the mongrels treated him when they excommunicated him from the gang and burned his tattoos off of his body, reflecting the injury the Rippers inflicted on Boozer and what he intends to do to Deacon here. Suddenly, it makes a lot of sense why everyone has been mentioning that the Rippers are looking for mongrels. Jesse begins burning a tattoo on Deacon's forearm and gloats that he doesn't want to finish this between just the two of them. He wants Boozer here to finish things together, so he leaves the room to bring Boozer here with Deke. After a while, Lisa enters, fully indoctrinated into the Ripper teachings, but she still seems to understand that Deacon helped her before, freeing him from his restraints and leaving. Deacon sneaks through the Ripper encampment and retrieves his gear and clothing. While leaving, he notices Lisa being dragged away by a Ripper, begging for her life again. Deacon intervenes one more time, trying to offer to take her to Lost Lake again, but she's not on board. She gives Deacon one last hug and the two split off to head out on their own. Deacon makes it back to his bike at the hiking trail and rides down to Lost Lake, but he's a little late to the party. Jesse has already sent Rippers down to Lost Lake in full force to rip the camp apart to bring Boozer back, and Deacon heads into the camp to fight back against their force. It's a pretty brutal assault. A lot of people are being killed and torn apart, buildings are being torched, and the progress at Lost Lake is being set back quite a bit by the attack. Deke fights his way through the camp, helping survivors along the way, and when he finally reaches the infirmary, a ceasefire is called between the groups. Deacon heads up to the Lost Lake Lodge to see about the ceasefire and finds Mike, Jesse, and Skizzo negotiating amongst their people. Deacon takes Skizzo in a chokehold to get him to confess to what he tried to do to Boozer and Deke, but Mike asks for him to be released. Mike confirms the deal Skizzo tried to set up with Jesse and forcefully asks him to leave with a standoff between everyone in the lodge. Jesse and Mike confirm their peace treaty still stands, and the Rippers walk out of the lodge. Mike knocks Skizzo out and sends him to the Lost Lake jail. The biker boys step outside to talk about Jesse, both understanding that Jesse has clearly been searching for them for a while, even suggesting that the initial ambush on Boozer must have been a trap for them specifically. Deacon has a plan to deal with the Rippers en masse and tells Boozer to meet him as soon as Deacon can secure the dynamite and detonation cords away from Iron Mike. Deacon meets Addie to get his arm patched up and treated, if you are worried about that, and we go to meet Boozer to begin Deacon's assault on the Rippers. Deke's plan is to blow up the dam containing a local reservoir that's directly above the Ripper headquarters to drown out the majority of their forces. A quick sniper defense section while Boozer sets the charges, and we do just that, blowing up the dam and flooding the region. Following the flood, Deke and Boozer head off to finish off Jesse, trying to close the book on the Ripper story. Reaching the Ripper compound, Boozer lifts us up into an elevated boss arena, again relegating him to being useless for essentially no reason other than forcing him into being useless. Once we're up here, Deacon is ambushed by Jesse, holding him down and blowing some PCP, a hallucinogenic drug, into Deke's eyes, disorienting him for the fight. Let's see how this finale for our currently main antagonist plays out. Yeah, what the hell was that? We get a big reveal about the big bad Ripper that's been hunting us for the last 20 hours of gameplay, and since that reveal, another half hour has passed and he's dead. This is an extremely underwhelming setup for what should have been the next chapter of the game. It feels like they blew their load early with the Lost Lake invasion and are now having to run aftercare for Deacon Boozer's big emotions about the Jesse reveal. I don't really understand how this seemed satisfactory on paper. I think if Jesse's identity was hinted at or shown much earlier, maybe even at the initial ambush at the beginning of the game, and piecing together that Carlos is Jesse over the next 24 hours, handling him so quickly at the end of the second act wouldn't be such a big deal. But the fact that he's shown and killed within half an hour of gameplay is honestly shocking that it passed some early design drafts. This might be one of the worst setups for an antagonist that I've ever seen in a modern game, and it is definitely one of the weakest points in the story of Days Gone as a whole. I don't know much about Jesse, I don't know much about his time with the mongrels past his brutal excommunication, and I definitely don't know his relationship with Deacon and Boozer past the tattoo burning. Jesse in the story feels like wasted potential at its best and a rushed plot thread at its worst, and I flip between both feelings whenever I think about his part in the overall narrative. Following the fight, Deacon and Boozer ride back to Lost Lake, and Deacon walks in on Mike praying. Mike's faith is clearly shaken up after the Ripper attack, but is quick to straighten up to talk to Deacon. Deke tells him that what he did to the Rippers was necessary, that nowadays everything is either us or them. Mike bites back by saying that people haven't realized that the us should be everyone still alive, and the them should be any infected, not their fellow survivors. Mike restates his stance on the world today, that once everything cleans up, the world is going to be what everyone's made of it, and it's up to the good of the people to make it a better place. Mike also tells Deacon that he ended up letting Skizzo go, trying to prevent at least one death out of the tragedy that's been going on the last few days. While leaving Lost Lake, Deacon sees Ricky teaching Addie how to start a motorcycle, which brings on a memory Deacon has of one of the first times he let Sarah drive his motorcycle. The two ride across a quiet road outside of her workplace, a botanical research lab working on a classified government project. While riding, a truck again narrowly misses the couple, and they joke about how dangerous it is to be on a bike with Deacon. They continue to talk about Deacon going nomad in the MC, meaning he's stepping down from official responsibilities to have more free time to be with Sarah, which I think is another great mark to bolster the wedding scene, showing us that Deacon gave up part of his life for his love of Sarah too. A police cruiser drives by towards Sarah's office, and the two head back in case there's an emergency. The point of this flashback might initially seem like Deacon imposing a memory on what's happening in front of him and remembering the moment he told Sarah he was going nomad to, again, show us he made sacrifices for her, but once Deke is done reminiscing, we're shown what he was really remembering. Sarah was a federal employee, a private researcher for a government-funded project, which leads Deacon to contacting O'Brien with that information since, like he said, only people with authorization and clearance would have been evacuated, and Sarah might fall into that camp with her previous work. O'Brien agrees to poke around for Deacon some more and says that he'll be in touch. But before we meet with O'Brien, we can have another optional visit to Sarah's memorial, this time reflecting on Jesse and Deacon's past together. Deacon opens up about what happened before the apocalypse, saying that he never told Sarah originally because he didn't think she'd want to be with someone that could do something like that, but now Deacon doesn't care what she'd think of him because he does what he has to do, continuing that he went as far as killing him just recently. This again just plays into my dislike of how Jesse was handled during the second act. I think this exposition of how Jesse was treated in the MC before we could meet him could have bolstered the impression we get when we finally do meet him, and let what the Rippers do to people sink in for a longer amount of time before they're mostly dealt with their treatment of others clearly being a reflection of what happened to Jesse and the Mongrels. Anyways, O'Brien is pretty quick to get back to us on his new search with Sarah, and lucky for us, he's got something pretty positive. O'Brien located her old security badge from her workplace and found that she would have evacuated with the VIPs at the refugee camp, to a recon camp south of a nearby mountain range. Unfortunately, that camp was overrun by a local militia that is trying to reclaim the valley, a militia that has enough firepower that even Nero in their armored helicopters hesitate to visit the area. O'Brien fills us in that he knows where their main camp is, in Crater Lake, and wants to impose one last bit of info about the freaks to Deke and the player. The freaks are evolving rapidly, and things around the world are going to get a lot worse. With that, O'Brien boards his helicopter and Deacon has a new goal: find a way over the southern mountains and find that militia camp. We have another chance to visit Sarah's memorial, and this time, Deacon is trying to close this chapter of mourning Sarah properly, etching out the carving of her name in the rock and thanking her for letting him talk to her for the last 2 years. As he leaves, Deacon puts his wedding ring back on and we head back down to Lost Lake to speak to Iron Mike about a way over the Tealson Pass, the mountain range blocking the southern region. Iron Mike isn't quick to help Deacon with the recent events he's been involved with, so Deke decides the only way he might be able to get help from him is to appeal to his emotions and more human side, opening up about looking for Sarah and that he feels that looking for her is the only thing he has left, and that it might absolve his feelings if what he's had to do so far was just to find her. Mike agrees to show Deacon the path over the mountains on the condition that he never returns to Lost Lake, regardless of what happens over there. Deacon wants to say goodbye to Boozer before he heads to the south, and Deke wants to give his mongrel cut back to Boozer to hold on to for him. Boozer is very understanding of what Deacon has to do, saying that what they've been doing is just surviving, but surviving isn't living, that you have to have something to come home to at the end of the day. The two hug it out, and Boozer lets Deacon go to meet with Mike. Before he can slip out the front gate though, Ricky wants to confront Deacon about chasing ghosts one last time, frustrated that he's still stuck in the past and refuses to accept the life that he has now. Addie intervenes, expressing that she understands what Deacon feels like he has to do. Ricky has one last piece on her mind for Deke though, telling him that she thinks he's afraid to be a part of something bigger than him, and that he's afraid to have people rely on him. And I think that's what Days Gone is about at its core, what I mentioned earlier, the redemption of Deacon St. John, not as a man who wronged a lot of people and needs to turn things right, but as an isolated loner who needs to change to let people in. We've still got a good chunk of the narrative ahead of us, still about 15 hours of gameplay if you can believe it, but I think this message from Ricky is setting us up for the final chapter of Deacon's character arc. Mike finally greets us at the Lost Lake Gate and we begin a ride south towards Tealson Pass. The ride with Mike is mostly reflective on the past, not recent events with Carlos, but the valley that Mike remembers growing up in the area. Mike has one last push to get Deacon to stay, but it's clear we're past convincing. Reaching Crater Lake, we're greeted with a light blizzard while we ride up the mountain, which I really love. It's a hard contrast to the weather we've seen throughout the game, and it really feels like you're approaching something new. Mike asks Deacon one last time if he's sure he wants to go through with this and asks him, even if Sarah is still alive, does it matter now that everyone else is gone? With that question, Mike rides off to leave Deacon to climb the Thielsen Pass, and we get a second needle drop moment in the campaign, the one that I think is much more appropriate and has been earned by the game at this point. The song here is Hell or High Water, performed by Billy Raffle, and while I think its message might be right on the nose for what's going on with Deacon, I think it's better than a mixed signal that doesn't really fit what's happening in the story. To me, the song is clearly about losing a loved one and how holding on to the memory of them and what they helped you feel or learn can be enough to keep going on in life after their passing, which is clearly a direct thread for Deacon and his memory of Sarah. I mentioned it the last time I was complaining about licensed music, but this moment has finally become earned in my opinion. We've been with Deacon a while now, and we understand his character much deeper, and we can relate to this endless search for Sarah much more than we could relate to and understand the inclusion of the previous song. This is going to go a little off the rails here, so here's a timestamp on screen if you're tired of me complaining about the use of music in the narrative. In Red Dead Redemption, about a third of the way through the main campaign, we're hit with the first and only use of a licensed song in the game when John Marston is forced into Mexico to continue the search for the men he needs to kill to free his family from captivity. The song here is Far Away by Jose Gonzalez, which immediately hits you with the themes of feeling lost and confused in life with what the artist feels he has to do to feel anything anymore, which directly ties to John Marston's journey across the American Southwest to finally reunite with his family. On top of that, John's mission for his family has been the driving force for the entire game, so we can understand the correlation between the song and what we're meant to feel with his travel to Mexico, his doing whatever it takes just to feel alive again. Obviously, I'm mentioning this moment in an unrelated 15-year-old game to drive home the point I had about the use of the first song at the beginning of Days Gone. The point being that it hadn't earned that moment with the characters yet, and it felt like they just wanted to have this great journey moment that might have felt empty without a song, so they pulled one that John Garvin liked from a TV show. I'm also mentioning this moment from Red Dead Redemption to praise this second song and this transition into the third act of Days Gone. From what I can tell, the song was written and composed for the game, which really accentuates the intent behind using it here, and like I just said, I think we've earned this moment by how much we've been through with Deacon at this point. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but you're over an hour deep into someone reading too far into a game already, so I'd assume that's what you're here for. Passing over the peak of the mountain, Deacon hears gunshots and screaming nearby and heads over to investigate, then getting a distress call to confirm that someone needs help. Reaching the commotion, we're greeted by a massive infected bear and some soldiers trying their best not to feed it. We take out the bear, apparently called a Rager, and the surviving soldiers are grateful for the save, offering Deacon a bed and a hot meal for the trouble. Deacon continues down the mountain with them to continue to investigate the area, eventually reaching the Diamond Lake Outpost, a military camp set up in the remains of a completely torched forest. Much like the change into a snowstorm coming up Thielsen Pass, I really like the heavy visual contrast here with this destroyed forest. It really invokes a sense of despair seeing all the trees burnt to ash and leveled with only the base and some other structures left standing. Riding into the outpost, we're greeted by Captain Curry, the man running the camp. Curry comes across as a no-nonsense but compassionate leader, with the death report from his soldier being harsh news but accepted pretty quickly, which I like. This quickly characterizes Curry for the player as someone rational at the very least. Curry offers to shake Deacon's hand to thank him for saving his men, and Deacon notices that Curry is wearing Deacon's mongrel ring, presumably only a ring that a member would have, and likely the same exact ring that Deacon gave Sarah before he put her on the helicopter on the night of the outbreak. Deke is clearly shaken by this, but quickly thinks on his feet to sign himself up as a recruit for the militia to get closer to get some answers about Sarah. Corey agrees to give us a trial run, showing us around the camp and filling us in on a job to track a deserter to see if Deacon is worth recruiting. Riding with Curry, Deacon immediately proves himself useful by applying his tracking skills to follow the deserting soldier, and piecing together some clues on what led to their decision. It looks like the soldier was secretly giving away militia supply runs and generally sabotaging their efforts in the area. We find the deserter holed up with some new friends and quickly take care of them. With the mission complete, Curry is sufficiently impressed with Deacon and takes him down to the militia headquarters to be sworn in as a new recruit. Riding along further south with Curry, he presses Deacon about his military service, with both men mutually noticing a certain look that people who served tend to have. They bond a bit more, with Curry sharing a photo of his wife after Deacon mentions his, though lying about her name and saying that he knows she's dead. This leads us into another flashback of the game, the night Deacon proposed to Sarah. I've already talked about this one a bit, but to cover all my bases during the memory, the two talk a bit about their relationship during a midnight hike towards a waterfall. Their relationship seems better than ever, talking about how serious the relationship has gotten, with Deacon telling his family and the MC and them joking about moving in together. Reaching the waterfall, Deke proposes with his mongrel ring and Sarah accepts on 2 conditions. They don't have a biker wedding, where she directly quotes the line from before, and that he promises to never leave her. We get a nice close look at the ring that Captain Curry is currently wearing, and the memory is cut short with Curry directing us down to the last stretch towards the militia headquarters. Arriving at the HQ, the folks call it Wizard Island, we're greeted by Colonel Garrett along with 2 other recruits. There's brief storylines with each of them, but I don't really think they're worth talking about extensively. All we need to know is that they're both less qualified, less professional candidates than Deacon. Garrett immediately notices Deacon's military demeanor and takes a liking to him, recruiting him as a corporal and giving him a personal tour of Wizard Island. During the tour, we get a bit of a read on Garrett. He's a very religiously devout man that seems to be fluffing up his theological expertise to seem more deep and insightful than he really is. Garrett further fills us in on what the militia aims to do, to properly fight back as a force against the freaks and reclaim what they've lost. We meet a few key figures in the camp during this tour. The only 2 that I care to mention are Lieutenant Weaver, an eccentric chemical engineer trying to create a weapon to fight back against the freaks. The last important member of the militia is, who could have guessed it, Sarah, Deacon's wife. Meeting with each other face to face after 2 years clearly has them both shaken and at a loss for words. But Sarah also seems much different from the woman we've seen throughout the game in Deacon's memory, seeing her berate and belittle a soldier that was doing a supply run for her. Sarah puts on an act in front of the colonel to see if Deacon is up to snuff to be her new supply runner, and with the colonel pleased, he leaves the 2 alone to plan her next requisition. Sarah clears the tent of all other militia personnel, and it's obvious that Deacon still being alive doesn't feel real to her. She touches his face and recoils from the memory and begins spiraling, likely remembering the last 2 years without him. The 2 embrace and kiss and try to catch up on how they lost each other, talking over one another and ending on,
I never thought I would see you again.
I like this reunion a lot. It feels very human, from the shock to the relief and the need to explode with answers and questions, but the moment isn't over yet. Deacon grabs Sarah by the hand and tries to lead her out of the camp to leave on their own, but Sarah pulls away, saying that she can't just leave. Sarah believes in the mission here to fight the freaks, and she thinks that she can really make a difference with her work for the militia. The moment is cut short with another militia member coming in to find Deacon, but before we leave, Sarah pushes a requisition form onto Deke, which unfortunately kind of sets up our relationship with Sarah for the majority of the final act. Over the next 10 or 15 hours, Sarah is mostly relegated to a quest giver asking Deacon to find random bits and bobs throughout the valley, which really hampers the emotional connection of finding her after all this time. I get that it might be going for an unsatisfactory conclusion right now to match how Deacon feels, but I think it pulls back from the emotional stakes a little too hard, and becomes a little too video gamey. Which, yeah, I know sounds ridiculous in a video game, but I'm sure you know what I mean. It's like when a companion in a dozen-hour-long game finally gets exhausted of unique dialogue and just becomes a talking head to spout some generic lines. So, to skip ahead past the busy work, we collect random junk for both Sarah and Weaver's experiments, like styrofoam for Weaver to create napalm to really burn down the freaks, and some yeast for Sarah to research proteins in yeast for an attempt at a different solution. Bringing supplies back to Sarah has both of them confronting how awkward things have been, and Sarah continues to be flippant on the military facade and behaving normally around Deke, but she always just gives him another requisition form at the end of it. Again, I really dislike how Sarah is handled here. Each interaction awkwardly ends with her giving Deacon the next item list she wants for the quest log, and it feels unnatural. I think this could have been mitigated with keeping the Sarah missions to specific missions where she leaves the base with Deacon to have proper interactions between the two. Maybe even going a step further to making Weaver and Sarah's requisition forms a one-stop shop for Deacon so it isn't out of the blue when Sarah requests to work for him personally, but that way we can still establish the working relationship here with the shopping list and see the dichotomy between their research without Sarah just being an awkward quest giver. The awkward nature of these interactions is addressed head-on by Deacon and Sarah, but calling it out doesn't make the design any better. In fact, I think it might just highlight it further to someone that might not have noticed. During the third act, we get some optional objectives to listen to Colonel Garrett's fireside chats, a speech he gives to soldiers in the middle of Wizard Island. These speeches give a lot more insight into what kind of man Colonel Garrett is, which, again, he's a religious zealot who's progressively pushing his ideas onto his people in the framing of a war against the freaks. I think leaving this as optional is important, because while they do set up Garrett as an unstable character, I think they're pretty annoying to listen to. I think I skipped each one during this playthrough since I already knew what Garrett was going to become. During our requisition runs, we'll occasionally hear a conversation between Sarah, Weaver, and Garrett, or some combination of the three, and we get a clear picture that Garrett is prioritizing Weaver's work on a weapon against the freaks above Sarah's solution to the infection, which increasingly frustrates Sarah and puts a lot of tension between the higher-ups in the militia. And speaking of the competition between the two, thanks to Deacon's supply runs, Weaver has made a lot of progress on his weapon, portable napalm Molotovs, which forces Sarah to start making some serious progress on her work, asking Deacon to join her on a run to her old workplace, Cloverdale, for some lab equipment. And I like this a lot. This and another time that Sarah decides to head out with Deacon are the only time that Deke opens up to someone, other than Boozer, openly about his feelings and what's been going on. The first time, he briefly tells Sarah about the last 2 years, and he lets her know that Boozer is still around, but settled in the camp up north. Deke also asks about his mongrel ring, probably trying to inquire about her relationship with Curry, but she shuts it down by saying she had to give away all her personal belongings when she joined, so she doesn't know what happened to the ring. During this second run, Deke criticizes the need for the militia's formalities, and Sarah comes back wondering how Deacon could feel that way when the MC had ranks and uniforms with their cuts and tattoos. Deke also opens up a bit more on why he's kept going the last 2 years, deciding that making sure Boozer survived his injuries and now finding Sarah were the only things that kept him going, and that he was even suicidal, but he plays off the latter as a joke, unfortunately. No big opening up moment from Deacon yet. Reaching Cloverdale, the facility seems to still be online and partially functional, with the electric fence running and a garden in the yard being actively watered. With that, Sarah figures she can log in with her old biometric data, and she's right, we get inside pretty easily. Inside, we see some long dead corpses that Deacon and Sarah put together were executed when they tried to leave the facility, likely when the outbreak started. Trying the front door, Sarah's sign-in doesn't seem to work, so we head around to an emergency exit, noticing that someone is actively watching us over a security camera. Entering through the back, we set off an alarm and find some men inside ready to kill us. So we kill them and work our way through the facility. There's a small reveal here that the person running things here is an old security guard that Deacon had issues with. We see him in a flashback, but I don't think it's super relevant, so we aren't digging into that. The big reveal here is what Cloverdale was up to before the outbreak, apparently being the company that actually created the virus and that has caused the freaker infection. Sarah says that she had a feeling that her work went over her head and against her contract to not be weaponized when an intern tried to tell her about some shady stuff that Cloverdale was up to prior to the outbreak. She ignored the intern, trying not to get involved with a whistleblower against a massive company, and she's regretted that decision for the last 2 years. She thinks the intern was infected when he tried to steal a sample, and when he went to try and meet a reporter and traveled quite a bit, he likely became a super spreader for the infection. Sarah is obviously very affected by her work being used against her wishes like this, and it makes a clear through line on why she's adamant on working to find something to combat the infection now. I think it's a bit cliche for the one scientist character we know being the exact person who created the virus, but they do give some leeway to that cliche, with Sarah expressly stating a few times before this reveal that she believes all her work was above ground and for a good cause. It's not like she worked for the Umbrella Corporation and is lying to herself. Deacon takes the news pretty well, honestly. He accepts his mass extinction event wife and sends her off to load up the equipment she wanted. Deke also turns off the electric fence surrounding the facility and radios Lost Lake Camp to tell them about the abundance of food available here since they just slaughtered everyone inside, but he leaves out that last part. Calling Lost Lake, Boozer picks up and is pretty emotionally distraught that Deke isn't coming back with Sarah, at least not yet, so Deke has to relay the message to Ricky. Ricky is happy to hear that Sarah is actually alive, and Deacon admits that she was right before, that Deacon did need to find something to come home to. Riding back to Wizard Island, Sarah and Deke get caught in a blizzard and hole up in an abandoned cabin. Convenient excuse for them to finally have an intimate night together, not much else to add. Getting back to the Wizard Island base, Sarah decides to sneak a quick kiss to Deacon, and Captain Curry notices from a distance. Oh yeah, there's a doctor in camp and he gets killed by one of those new recruits that joined with Deacon. I don't really care to go through this little storyline, but I'm mentioning it here because this death deeply affects Colonel Garrett, but it's a relatively small tick on the time bomb of Garrett's inevitable emotional explosion. I also think Garrett might have been in a romantic relationship with the doctor, or at least had some romantic feelings for him, so that further explains why this death impacts him so much. Following the Cloverdale visit, Sarah asks Deacon to catch a newt alive so she can test her latest serum. Along the way to the newt Sarah has in mind, Curry reaches out to ask Deacon to help test Weaver's weapon. Unfortunately, it seems like he's making some good progress too. Securing the newt and bringing it back to base, Sarah gets to inject her serum into the newt. It doesn't go exactly how Sarah wants. The serum she made causes an intense reaction in the newt and kills it immediately. Sarah is extremely upset by this, ready to give up on her research, but Deacon doesn't let her and tells her to keep going since this entire time he's been back with her, she's been referring to freaks as infected people, even calling the newt she just killed a little kid. Clearly, Sarah sees the freaks as people that she can still help, which tells Deacon that she needs to find a solution because she hasn't lost her humanity like everyone else that's still around, adding that the world won't heal properly if people like her aren't around when everything might be better. Deke has a bit of a monologue here about the past 2 years, realizing the night he lost Sarah wasn't the night he put her on the helicopter, but the night after that when he tore through hundreds of freaks at the refugee camp in an attempt to find her. So he's been slowly losing his humanity and sanity over the last 2 years until he finally got a sliver of hope when he saw the first Nero helicopter. Deacon tells Sarah that he doesn't want to be in the militia, he doesn't want to fight a war against the freaks, but he'll do whatever he can to help her with her research.
They're just trying to survive, and here you are. Trying to save the goddamn world.
Yeah, good stuff. I think it's a powerful moment for the two of them. Sarah is ready to quit with her latest effort not panning out, but she's rallied by Deacon's belief in her, and Deacon gets some redemption here, finding a new purpose in helping Sarah. These crazy kids get a little caught up in their big plans to heal the world and decide to go AWOL on the militia, planning to ride up back to Cloverdale to work on the cure there. Unfortunately, before they can get packing, the Colonel wants to see Deacon so he can test Weaver's new weapon. Weaver and Garrett send Curry and Deke a little north of the base towards a known location of a horde. This is the first time in the game we're expected to fight a proper horde. We've fought groups of a couple dozen infected in what the game calls swarms, but this is a horde, a separate classification for freaks piled up in the hundreds. I'll talk a bit more about hordes later, but the narrative point here is seeing how effective Weaver's napalm Molotov is, and yeah, pretty effective. Reporting back in at Wizard Island, Deke tries to find Sarah and finds that her lab has been relocated. The death of the camp doctor has caused the Colonel to reassess where essential personnel are placed, so he wants them in a secure location, like inside the mountain on the island. Finding Sarah, it doesn't seem like she's just in a more secure spot, but that she's being kept prisoner in her new lab with an active guard 24/7 and her not being allowed to leave. Weaver is in the same boat, if you were wondering. It's not like Sarah specifically is being held hostage. Sarah asks us to track down a toxic herb for the next step of her research, some water hemlock, and Weaver asks us to get him an MP3 player. Right up until the very end of the game, we're still getting busy work from these two. It's kinda lame, but at least Sarah's becomes relevant. While we're out on the road, Deacon radios O'Brien again and asks him for help to evacuate Sarah from Wizard Island. O'Brien is hesitant since he knows that the island has some pretty heavy ordnance, but Deke is willing to try and disable that so his helicopter can pass through. O'Brien agrees if Deacon is willing to do one more odd job for him, asking Deke to locate a research group that was lost to a new mutation that Nero was trying to monitor, and asking him to perform a field biopsy on the new freak. We get a pretty fun set piece in a dark, spooky cave while we're being watched by the new freak, the Reacher. Yeah, they look pretty goofy. This reveal makes me chuckle more than anything. Anyways, we find this lost research group, get him the samples from the Reacher, and O'Brien is on board to pull Sarah out of Wizard Island when they're ready. Oh, we also fight a horde while escaping the spooky cave, extending that cool set piece with an intense fight in the dark. So, with the surface-to-air defenses disabled and O'Brien on board for evac, we're ready to ditch the militia and ride into the sunset with Sarah. If only it were that simple. Garrett holds a new fireside chat to speak about a new group of recruits who helped fuel his newfound xenophobia, wanting to destroy other camps out in the shit since they don't hold his vision. Yeah, he's gone full Lisan al-Gaib here. He wants to start a holy war against anyone that isn't part of the militia, so Deke expedites the rescue operation and calls O'Brien. Deke heads down inside the mountain to grab Sarah. We sneak up to the top of the mountain and, unfortunately, the Colonel is at the top speaking to his latest recruits, including Schizo. Schizo immediately shouts at Deacon, calling him a traitor, and O'Brien's flyby doesn't really help our case. Garrett takes both Schizo and Deacon back down the mountain to hear their testimony, and Schizo works along his religious fervor, telling Garrett to check Deacon's back for a tattoo of a satanic dog while also confirming the existence of the tattoo to prove he knows who Deacon is. Ripping off Deke's shirt, we see the mongrel tattoo, and yeah, to a guy that just declared a holy war, this is probably about as bad as it gets for hard launching the tattoo reveal. Schizo doubles down, saying that he saw Deke abuse women at Lost Lake, referring to the quiet moment with Ricky. Garrett moves on to Sarah's involvement, putting together that a Nero chopper just flew overhead and that she was recruited from a Nero group. Garrett pulls a gun on Sarah, which forces Deke to reveal that he's the one working with Nero, giving up his radio and making up a plan to kidnap Sarah for Nero's work. Garrett orders Curry to bring Deacon to the lockup and walks off with Schizo to get more information on Lost Lake to plan an attack. Curry knocks out Deke to move him to the brig, but when we wake up, it's clear that Curry has gone against the Colonel's wishes, taking Deacon outside of the base and offering him a chance to save Sarah. Curry put a few things together that led him to helping Deacon. The mongrel tattoo on Deke's back and the mongrel ring Curry's been wearing are clearly related, and with the ring being one of Sarah's personal items when she joined, Curry also put together that Sarah and Deacon must have been together before the outbreak. Curry respects Deacon's drive for finding his wife after all this time, and hasn't been corrupted like some other members of the militia, so he's ready to defect, and helping Deacon escape is a happy coincidence. With his new freedom, Deke decides he needs to head back north to warn Lost Lake about the militia, but it seems like he's a little late. Radioing into Lost Lake, it seems like they're in the middle of a skirmish, and Deacon makes double time on riding up to the camp. As he approaches, it looks like Lost Lake has repelled this first wave, but unfortunately, Iron Mike was fatally wounded in the fight. Deke joins Ricky and Addie at his deathbed, and Deke tells him that he found Sarah, giving him some comfort and resolution that Deke is on a better path. Deacon lies and says that Sarah is right outside to meet him, again giving him some comfort and a nice thought to end things on. Mike then tells Deacon that he thinks he's been wrong, that you do have to do whatever it takes to keep what's important to you safe, and with that, Mike passes away. Ricky and Deke try to speak to Lost Lake to let them know that Iron Mike has passed, and Deacon has some trouble rallying folks, so Ricky tries to calm the crowd, but Deacon can't yet accept this position as someone to rally people as a leader. Deke steps away to put in motion a plan with Boozer, deciding on building a massive car bomb to ride directly into the center of Wizard Island, with the rest of Lost Lake following for a full-on assault. Everyone is on board since they don't really have any better ideas, so the team gets cracking on putting together the bomb. What this means for the player is an extended sequence of getting the supplies together, some fertilizer and creosote to fill a large truck to create an improvised explosive. So we kill a couple of hordes, one of them is the mission that was featured in the original reveal of the game in 2016, fun fact, and with the truck filled up, we're ready for the assault on Wizard Island. Boozer and Deke talk one last time before they head out, with Boozer giving Deacon his mongrel cutback for a final dumbass biker stunt. Ricky pulls up with Addie and shows that the people of Lost Lake are rallying behind the attack for their memory of Iron Mike. Pulling into Wizard Island, Boozer's at the wheel of the car bomb and he decides to not jump in time to avoid the explosion to make sure the bomb goes off without a hitch. At least he pretends to. It's a fake out, and I don't really understand what they gained trying to pull the emotional card here just to show us that he survived in the next 20 minutes. It feels really cheap since it gets revealed so quickly, so I can't really justify the decision to do the fake death. We're already fighting through Wizard Island for Mike's memory and to get back Sarah. Did we really need to think Boozer was dead too? The assault through Wizard Island goes off pretty well, with Deke fighting into the caves inside the mountain to reach the Colonel's quarters where he has Sarah captive. Along the way, we also get a final confrontation with Schizo, with Deacon gutting him and taunting Schizo while he tries to crawl away, savoring the moment in finishing him off. This one isn't exactly a boss fight, it's a quick laser pointer avoiding section. Thought we left those in 2007, but whatever. And then it's a quick time event to wrestle a knife away from Schizo. And honestly, I like this more than the Carlos sequence. It's focused on being cinematic, and it doesn't try to be something more than it was like the last boss fight with Carlos. And I think Jesse has earned this moment where Carlos definitely did not. He's been an asshole the entire time we've known him, and once Deke was finally warming up to him, he betrayed us and got away with it. And all of that happened over the course of the second act of the game, probably through about 12 hours of gameplay, instead of under an hour. Not to mention the reveal here in Act 3 and the worm tongue shit he was on with the Colonel. He definitely deserved this to Deacon, and the player would reasonably want that satisfaction too. With Schizo dead, we reach the Colonel's quarters. He's got a couple of soldiers in the cave with him and Sarah held at gunpoint, forcing Deacon to drop his weapon. He invites Deke to drink a cup of tea with him, but Sarah subtly hints that he shouldn't drink it. Deke riles the Colonel up with insults, leading to a struggle, and the Colonel definitely has the upper hand until the poison that Sarah puts in the tea sets in and kills him immediately. Hey, look at that. One of those fetch quests resulted in something tangible for the narrative. I'm being a little facetious here. Obviously, we developed Sarah's character and relationship with Deacon, but man, I really dislike the structure for the third act of this game. Anyways, with the Colonel dead, his militia seemingly stands down immediately. We see that Ricky and Addie survived the assault, thank God we didn't lose any more named characters, and wow, look at that, Boozer didn't die in the explosion like I said. Everyone gathers around a bonfire while the sun rises, and Deacon gives a speech to the survivors. It's a nice moment for Deacon. He's definitely channeling a bit of Iron Mike here with an outlook on the future and focusing on being the best that you can for the people that will come after you. And here's the final nail in Deacon's development. He's accepting his place in Lost Lake Camp as someone to look up to and rely on, and he's looking to the future of himself and the people around him, not just drifting through life like he has been the last 2 years. Ricky's message at the end of Act 2 was right. Deacon needs to light a candle somewhere to have something to come home to so he can be complete. It doesn't hurt that the something he found was his dead wife that he's been looking for. Pretty easy for him to make that connection, but it was true. Deacon needed a reason to live, just like Boozer, just like Ricky, and just like Iron Mike believed in. During the credits, we get a montage of everyone riding back to Lost Lake, and it's set to a nice song. It's a more hopeful one than we've heard before, and it's very fitting. The end of Days Gone is very light and hopeful, which, frankly, is a nice way to end things for Deacon St. John after his dozens of hours long depression simulator. But that's not quite the end. There's a bit more story content piecemealed over the course of an in-game week, and just to keep all the spoilers contained, let's wrap that up here. So, with everyone happily back at Lost Lake Camp, the first thing Deacon wants to do is go back to Wizard Island. Yeah, seriously, he wants to get his rings back. It's a pretty quick moment. All of these epilogue missions are pretty quick, honestly, but it's a nice enough moment with Deacon reuniting with his mongrel ring and being comfortable enough to put his wedding ring back on too. The next bit of closure we get is visiting Iron Mike's grave with Addie and Ricky. Ricky carved a headstone out of redwood for Mike with an old Hindu proverb, focused on the idea of doing what you can for the future for the benefit of the people that will come after you, which again was the core of what Iron Mike was all about. Next up, we get to see Lisa one last time. She's rolling up to the front gate of Lost Lake Camp, seemingly hardened by being out in the shit on her own. She's got her own bike, some new clothes, and she's clearly trying to channel Deacon with her new life, choosing to be a drifter and claiming bounties for freaks like he did. Deke obviously still sees the little kid he saw before, trying to get her to stick around and meet some folks around camp, but she's pretty against the idea. In the end, Deke finally gets her to roll into the camp though, so I'll take it as he won and Lisa finally got a more normal life. Last and definitely not least, we get to meet with O'Brien one more time too. O'Brien calls Deke to meet one more time, choosing to warn him about what's coming. Things are going to get worse, the freaks are evolving, and there's nothing people can do to save themselves. And O'Brien has proof this time. He removes his mask and he's infected himself, a freak-human hybrid. O'Brien has clearly retained his intelligence and part of his more human side, but we get a clear indication that he's evolving physically, with him leaping a good 6 feet into the bed of his helicopter. Deacon summarizes this one pretty well.
What the fuck?
Sure, a little sequel bait at the end of the post-game content, and I like it enough. We get a new type of threat established, a foreboding warning, and not much else so we can sit and stew on what could come next. And with that, we can finally call it a wrap on Days Gone's narrative. Overall, I like the journey that it takes you on. I think it's at its best during the second act once Deacon is more established as a character and we have some surrounding figures in play, like Ricky and Iron Mike. The opening is pretty weak in my opinion. Like I mentioned before, I don't really get a strong connection to Boozer in the first dozen hours, and the reliance on him for the narrative doesn't really land to me. But by the time we're at Lost Lake Camp, things start to get in a good rhythm and the characters are getting more interesting, especially Deacon and Boozer, despite the writer's need to make Boozer feel useless. I think the third act of the game is really rough, gameplay-wise. The reveal with Sarah is fine, if a little too predictable with the rest of the game building her up, but I do like that the overall game ends on a high note for Deacon. As I said before, the reliance on fetch quests in the third act to drag out the runtime is definitely noticeable and not very interesting on a narrative level. But I think the characters involved, when they are involved and not just quest givers, make up for the lackluster gameplay content. Colonel Garrett might be a bit of a cliche, but he's a fun antagonist to root against, a sort of divine evil. And we get resolution from an Act 2 asshole, Schizo, who turned out to give us some good satisfaction when he's finally killed. Corey and Sarah also definitely help the third act. Sarah has obviously been talked about and shown to us for the last 30 or so hours, so finally getting to see how she's turned out over the last 2 years is great. Not to mention the relief and development she gives to Deacon to finally heal from his 2 years of guilt and trauma. Corey gives us a shoulder to lean on and ends up being a good friend to Deacon and a man of principles that we can respect as a character. All in all, I think Days Gone's story is pretty good. I know it's a big ask to tell someone to play a dozen hours of a game before it gets good, but I think the good that you get to is worth the journey. Deacon is one of the more interesting video game protagonists I've ever seen. Like I said before, he's clearly mentally unstable, and that's constantly reflected in his performance from Sam Witwer, and how he interacts with characters throughout the game, which makes his turn into someone that can settle down and become a pillar of a community a satisfying conclusion to me. I do wish we'd see more of that Deacon through the game's epilogue content, but I know that's a big ask for even more story after easily 40 hours of content. Which does lead me to the very last point I have for the narrative section of this video. I know what you're thinking, when's this guy gonna talk about the game? In about 55 seconds, just bear with me. I don't know if I'd want a sequel to Days Gone. I know that's a big talking point with the game, and there's been some effort from Ben's studio and all these articles floating around with Sony turning down the pitches, and I think that's okay. I don't think I need to see more of Deacon St. John. I'm happy with how things ended for him. I don't think seeing him struggle and go through hell again would be satisfying to me. A sequel without Deacon could work, but I think Deacon as a character is what really ties the game together to be more than just another open-world zombie game. Which I think it is more than that in gameplay too, but Deacon is undeniably the core of the experience. His entire character ties into a lot of the systems at play here that make Days Gone unique, so I'm really not sure how well another character could sell me on the world that Deacon lives in. And let's talk about that world and gameplay finally. This video is already too damn long. When you start a new save in Days Gone, you're prompted with a choice of 4 difficulty options and 2 optional modified versions of Hard and Survival, the 2 highest difficulty modes. I played through the game for this video and my initial playthrough on the Survival difficulty, which I think is the best way to experience Days Gone for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the Survival difficulty disables most HUD elements, or heads-up display elements, which can be prompted to briefly appear at the press of a button. I like this a lot. I like a minimal HUD in most games and will even modify the heads-up display if I think a game makes a screen too busy with too many random things. I think a minimal HUD serves well in Days Gone. It allows you to focus on the action around you in combat and helps you focus on your surroundings while driving your bike. Mission objectives prompt you frequently and in-world navigation markers are present, so the lack of a constant health bar, ammo indicator, and minimap aren't really lost on me. On top of that, I don't really think the HUD in Days Gone is very appealing to look at, but I'll dig into that later. The other major change that Survival difficulty makes is entirely disabling fast travel, forcing you to travel through the world manually, which I think is a huge plus for the difficulty. I tend to avoid fast travel in games if I can, especially on my first playthrough of a game, because I really like to take in the world that's been created and curated, especially if traveling through the world is interesting or rewarding. I think Days Gone meets the interesting half of that. Driving through rural Oregon is fun and engaging with how you're expected to manage the gas on your bike, and with the overall presentation of the world and progression through the regions. It's interesting to drive from Belknap to Iron Butte because there's a few things you need to consider: the route you want to take, how much gas you'll need or have to find along the way, and what you might encounter in your drive, like a bandit ambush or a roaming horde, which is affected by how much of the world you've made safer. I understand a desire for fast travel in most games, but I really think Days Gone is serviced by traveling through the world yourself, learning the routes you can take, and getting familiar with your bike, all of which is expected of you when you play the Survival difficulty. The other differences between difficulties is the amount of damage enemies deal and the amount of damage they need to take before they're defeated. Loot scarcity is also affected, with resources being less common on higher difficulties, which I think plays heavily into what makes playing Days Gone special. My point coming up ties directly into the combat of the game. I'll dig into specifics of combat mechanics in a second, but I want to establish what I think makes Days Gone stand out for you here to keep in your mind throughout the gameplay section of this video. Days Gone is absolutely at its peak in gameplay when you are forced to improvise. When you're running low on ammo and have to pick up an enemy's gun just to get the final shots off, or when your bike gets totaled in an ambush and you have to comb the area for just enough scrap to get back up and running. These are the moments in the game that make Days Gone really special to me. They're brief snippets of emergent gameplay that force you to engage with the world on a deeper level. And unfortunately, that emergent gameplay slowly gets taken away from you as the game goes on. With you getting stronger weapons and higher resource limits, you'll never want to pick up a low-tier rifle to end a fight, and you'll always have enough scrap to fix your bike up immediately. And I think this improvised gameplay would occur even less on lower difficulty modes. I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty with how the game limits my enjoyment of these systems as we go through the gameplay section, but again, I want this idea of improvised gameplay to be in the back of your mind as we go on. So let's quit delaying and talk about the actual gameplay of Days Gone. The combat in Days Gone has 2 phases and 2 approaches, both being available as much or as little as you want: a stealth phase or an aggressive phase, and a ranged approach or a melee approach. You can weave into both phases seamlessly in a fight, which allows you to enter and exit stealth as you please during an engagement. Let's start with the stealth gameplay because I don't really care for it and I didn't use it very much. The stealth mechanics rely on line of sight and sound, pretty standard stuff. If an enemy can see Deke, they're hostile. If an enemy hears Deke, they're investigating. Sometimes it's extremely easy to slip back into stealth in the middle of a firefight just by breaking the line of sight and hiding for a few moments. Enemies will completely go out of alert mode and go back to idling or patrolling, which makes the stealth gameplay far too easy in my opinion. If you're patient enough to walk up behind every enemy and hit the takedown button and willing to crouch in a bush for 10 seconds, you can sufficiently take out camps of enemies without being seen, which is further pushed by the enemies acting like a hive mind when detecting the player. If one sees you for even a second, everyone is on high alert and firing at your position. And yeah, like I said, you can just go hide in some grass for a moment, but this all or nothing detection system really feels dated even in a 2019 release. While you're in stealth, you have a couple of options to deal with enemies. You have a basic melee takedown, capable of killing any enemy with a single input from behind, even bigger or armored enemies with a skill you can unlock later. You can also attach suppressors to your guns, within reason, like you can't put the gas filter on a shotgun. This completely muffles your shots and allows you to take out enemies from a distance while remaining undetected. The suppressors have limited durability though, so you can't just sit 100 meters away and take pot shots forever. Enemies will also notice dead bodies, which puts them on a higher alert and breaks their usual patrol routes to find the player. Unfortunately though, enemies are also hyper aware of where they're being shot from, so if you miss a shot or hit them without taking them out instantly, the entire enemy group will be on you in an instant, again that hive mind stealth system at play. I don't think Days Gone does anything particularly interesting with stealth gameplay, and it feels like its inclusion was based around an industry expectation rather than someone wanting to create meaningful gameplay. I didn't engage with it much past using a suppressor to take out guards at a distance before I went into a camp head on, and I'm not given much of a reason to engage with it when the mechanics are so simple and easy to exploit. Thankfully though, aggressive, loud gameplay is Days Gone's bread and butter, and I'm gonna mix in talking about ranged and melee combat here because most systems in the combat are considerations for the aggressive gameplay. Ranged combat is primarily focused around firearms with the exception of a crossbow available to the player. Each ranged weapon in the game comes in a specific weapon tier tied to it, for 5 levels to distinguish between the guns: junk, poor, common, mil-spec, and special ops. I don't mind the tiered weapon system for the player, it's a quick way to give a gut check on what's an upgrade for us and what's effective in combat. Where my issues with the weapon tiers begin is that most enemies until the very end of the game do not scale with the player getting higher tier items. I understand this from the perspective of fleshing out the world. People out here only have what they can get their hands on, but it makes Deacon and the player a completely different force to deal with when my mil-spec handgun rips through anyone with a junk assault rifle. I think an easy way to mitigate this issue is already partially in the game. As it stands, you cannot store guns you find in the world in your gun locker for you to pull them out later or fill them up with ammo, which is a great way to incentivize you to invest in getting yourself better guns that are always available. I'd take this a step further though and just allow enemies to have higher tier weapons, not all the way to the end of the spectrum, but there's no reason for me to be 40 hours into the game and still coming across the same junk tier rifle while I have a special ops shotgun. It's a progression of power, sure, but it feels wholly unfair to the world of Days Gone that's established to be struggling and barely getting by. If I'm getting stronger and using more powerful guns, why can't the other guys? And if you have an explanation like, well, they're just drifting bandits and you work for the camps, that's true, but a lot of the bandits are stated to be people that have left or have been exiled from communities. Who's to say they didn't steal a gun or two? Which, if you haven't caught on, leads to a big problem for that improvised gameplay I mentioned earlier. There's absolutely no reason for me to ever drop one of my tier 5 guns for another gun that I find in the world. It will always be worse and it will always be more difficult to keep loaded than sticking to my personal weapon, which is a very enjoyable aspect for me in the beginning of the game, that heat of the moment decision to pick up someone's shotgun because I just ran out of rifle ammo, and you know what, I'm gonna hang on to this shotgun because I have a few more rounds for this instead. I understand that this is an entirely personal preference in how I enjoy the engagement of combat, but with the framing of the world and how enjoyable that pick up and burn gameplay feels at the beginning of the game, I can't help but feel the game becomes less fun as time goes on. But anyways, complaining out of the way, how do the guns feel? Pretty good. Aiming and firing feels fast and responsive with quick, tight camera controls and a satisfying recoil to your shot. You narrow your reticle and lower your aiming spread over time while you're holding the aim input, which gets even more accurate faster as you progress with perks and weapon tiers. I really like shooting in Days Gone, it feels like it has an impact and it's smooth to control. The weapons available to the player help create a distinct feeling between different firearm types, like shotguns, bolt-action rifles, fully automatic guns, and so on, with you being able to equip 3 separate guns across 3 different slots. You have a primary, a secondary, and special weapon slot, each coming with different types of gun you can equip for a pretty good variety for you to choose from. There's over 20 primary guns, over a dozen secondaries, and at least 10 special weapons. And again, there's a good selection here. I especially really like the guns chosen for the game. It's a weirdly niche and heavily World War II oriented lineup with rifle carbines and revolver rifles. It's kinda neat. And if you want to fulfill that legally distinct Daryl Dixon cosplay, there's even a crossbow available to you as a special weapon, like I mentioned before. I didn't use it very much, but I appreciate its inclusion to mix things up. When you're in a ranged encounter, you'll be expected to take cover, which is done contextually by crouching or aiming near an appropriately sized wall or object. I like contextual cover systems fine. I think when it works you don't notice how fluid it is, and when it doesn't it's the biggest pain on earth. Thankfully, Days Gone handles contextual cover well, and it gets a big plus from me by letting the player breathe with a shoulder swap while aiming. That might sound like a small grace, but man, when you can't quickly swap to the left in some games, you definitely feel it. I think the ranged combat is at its best when you're playing aggressively and pushing enemies with quick, tight shots from a semi-automatic gun. The fully automatic guns have their place in mowing down waves of enemies, we'll get to that, I promise, but the small ranged skirmishes are the most fun I had in combat thanks in large part to how in control certain weapons feel. If you're curious, I went through most of the game with the M14 as my primary weapon because, again, I liked the single shot, tight aim, quick response feeling it has. I used the sawn-off shotgun as my secondary and was very thankful that it was just given higher tiers as the game went on because I really enjoyed using it to clean up stragglers in a fight. And I usually had some high caliber rifle for my special weapon. The use of a scope was great for me to initiate fights, and the high damage output was great against higher tier enemies. The last part of ranged combat is the game's focus mechanic while aiming. This functions like a bullet time mechanic in any other game, slowing the world and allowing the player to aim in real time to place shots in quick succession. It works as you'd expect. It regenerates on a cooldown when not active, and it's a fun inclusion if nothing else. I don't think the game would be worse without it, but I probably wouldn't miss it if I never knew it was in the game. So, not to repeat myself too much, but as a whole, I think ranged combat is mostly enjoyable in Days Gone. The systems and mechanics for ranged combat are good, there's no doubt in my mind about that, but I think the enjoyment of combat is hindered by the power creep from the player in the late game, with you eventually hitting an entirely different league of weapons against your opponents. But I do love the variety of weapons available, and it feels like there's consideration for some different playstyles, like an all-out bullet machine or a stealth-focused sharpshooter. And with that, we can start talking about melee combat, which unfortunately I don't have as much praise for. If I were to quickly describe the melee combat in Days Gone, I would say it's fast, floaty, and awkward, but this entire video isn't me quickly describing anything. The melee combat revolves around single button inputs to perform a combo with a weapon, either Deacon's personal knife, which deals minimal damage, or some improvised weapon with limited durability. The melee combat definitely isn't the main course here. I'm not expecting Devil May Cry levels of comboing at all, but what is here is still lackluster. To hit an enemy, you have to be in melee range and you press the button. Deacon will figure out himself which direction to swing, mostly, and usually connects, which is fine for handling a few enemies, at most maybe 3, but trying to engage with melee past picking off the last few freaks in a horde is going to be a bad time. Deacon awkwardly warps in place to make sure his hit connects. The melee animation is a mostly dedicated input, so you can't exit once you've initiated an attack, and it just feels clunky to try and perform an extended combo, which can be extended further with a late game skill. In practice, melee combat feels something you have to want to do. It's almost never worth engaging in over shooting something unless you really need to save some bullets. Which is a shame because the melee combat can be very powerful in the late game. Like I said, the combat is based around Deacon's knife, which is very weak, and improvised weapons that you can craft or find in the world. Improvised weapons only have 2 stats, damage and durability, usually lowering one in the favor of the other. But those improvised weapons can be absolute powerhouses in the late game, taking down freaks and human enemies with just 2 or 3 swings. The late game melee weapons, the game labels them as superior, usually have high damage and durability, and are only ever found in the world, so finding one and keeping it around by repairing it is definitely worth the trouble, even if using it might feel awkward. I think an easy way to make melee combat feel more powerful and responsive would be including a skill later in the game that could allow for multi-hits with melee weapons, allowing Deacon to smack a couple of freaks with each swing. It might not look very graceful, but I think it would be a great way to reflect the progression of power in melee combat past the critical hit chance the game has for you now. And that's just my suggestion without a complete overhaul of the melee system. I would ideally like something that was a lot more engaging and fun to control, but I understand the design focus that likely went towards ranged combat. Oh, there's a dodge roll in the game too. It's an extremely loose movement that doesn't do much past avoiding a single melee attack or getting you back behind cover. It isn't animation or input based around enemies, so hitting the roll input will send Deacon moving in whatever direction you wanted while avoiding an attack. I think the damage frames are entirely based around his model, so if you roll too late or too early and still collide with an attack, you'll take damage. No invincibility frames here. I don't really like the dodge roll. It feels out of place in both melee and ranged combat, feeling awkward to perform up close and pointless to avoid gunfire. I think a sidestep or quick dodge for melee based around animation input from enemies would have been better suited, and it feels like the dodge roll in ranged encounters is a holdover from a hard cover system like the Uncharted games, at least to me. There is one last part of combat that kind of mixes in either approach you want to take, that being throwable and placeable traps and gadgets. There's an okay variety of each, like grenades, pipe bombs, molotovs, and attractors for throwables, and bear traps, remote explosives, and proximity mines for placeables. I think they're all fine. The majority of them are craftable with resources you find in the world, more on that soon, and they all have specific use cases that make them shine, like burning out nests with hordes or remote bombs to blast a chunk of a chasing horde. I don't have a whole lot to add about them. They function like you'd expect and are effective when used right, so they're flying under the radar from me and my nitpicking. So, as a whole, I think combat in the game is very good when approached correctly, using your firearms for aggressive, loud encounters, and pretty weak when trying to use stealth and attempting to use melee more than once in a while. I think taking Days Gone as a primarily third-person shooter would help you in the long run to enjoy the game more thoroughly, and like I mentioned before, that's highlighted and most enjoyable when emergent gameplay happens in the world. The most fun I have playing the game, either riding my bike through the countryside or fighting off a horde of freaks, is because something unexpected happens and I have to adapt to figure out how to overcome it. And I think that's the magic of Days Gone's core gameplay, combat or otherwise, the improvisation you can be forced into that sets it apart from some of its contemporaries. The world of Days Gone feels the most lived in and grounded when I have to interact with it, but unfortunately, as you progress in the game, it begins to give you too many opportunities to avoid that emergent gameplay. I'm going to continue to highlight my point on the improvised gameplay as it comes up, but I'm also going to talk about how the game detracts from that itself as you progress. It's kind of the core thesis of my thoughts on the gameplay if you couldn't tell already. Now that covers Deacon and the player's part in combat, so let's get right into who and what you'll be fighting throughout the game. The easiest group to talk about are the human enemies you'll face. They come in a couple different factions, Rippers, Anarchists, Marauders, and more, but they all boil down to a couple of types of enemies regardless of their allegiance. The first and most common are enemies with guns. These are pretty simple. They seek cover, they shoot at Deacon, they run away when you get too close, they'll try to flank, nothing too crazy. They're the basic enemy type in the game, so there isn't much special to them. They'll have a variety of weapons though. Similar to your arsenal, they can have rifles, handguns, and shotguns, which does seem to affect their script package on how they approach combat, with shotgunners trying to flush Deacon out of cover and riflemen keeping a distance, that kind of thing. Again, nothing special, but nothing really to detract from either. And while they are also ranged enemies with guns, I kind of count them as a separate enemy unit. We also have enemy snipers. They post up in specific spots in ambushes or bandit camps and have a laser sight to track where they're aiming. They're pretty easy to avoid, but I do have a specific gripe with them, that the dodge roll doesn't shake their tracking like you'd probably expect it to. Sticking to cover and shooting between their shots lets you take them down pretty easily, especially if you have a scoped rifle yourself. I mentioned it above, but all of the ranged enemies until the very last conflict in the game have stagnant weapon loadouts, with only using the lowest tier of gun available, poor quality. I really don't like this, so yes, I'm mentioning it again. I think it'd be more engaging for the sake of gameplay to have enemies get better gear alongside the player, and I'll stand by this against any world-building implication. Next up, we have melee enemies, enemies that rush Deacon with improvised melee weapons. They're essentially fodder enemies, and they charge Deke in a mostly straight line and try to whack you with a 2x4 or something similar. Their melee animations don't seem to have priority over Deacon, so they're extremely easy to counter just by swinging first if you aren't already shooting them. There is a special type of melee enemy for the Rippers. We'll call them, burners. They light themselves on fire and charge Deacon for a grapple, forcing a quick time event on the player and dealing continuous damage during the hold. These guys have some increased health if you let them self-immolate, so they're an interesting diversion in combat to keep an eye out for. And last, for our human enemies, we have armored enemies. These kind of come in tiers. I guess this is the only real progression of human enemies we get in the game. You'll encounter basic ranged enemies with helmets or armored vests as the first tier of armored goons, and then you'll find guys fully dressed in armor with machine guns, acting as a heavy type human enemy. Both of these armored opponents just need to be hit with consistent damage to break through the armor, then gunned down or whacked like any other opponent once the armor has been broken off. I like the human enemy variety enough. They're realistic at the very least. I think smarter scripting for the melee enemies could go a long way with making encounters more interesting, like if melee enemies could try to use stealth against the player, or even having that be a subsection of melee opponents, or having armored melee guys that give guaranteed drops of those superior weapons, forcing you to keep their distance while they're constantly trying to run you down. I also think it'd be interesting if the melee opponents could pick up dropped guns from their downed friends and switch up their approaches, creating more dynamic encounters, or even vice versa with ranged enemies could be something. Otherwise, I think the human enemy lineup is fine. They're the baseline encounter for the game, and they work for standard fair skirmishes. Where things get a bit more interesting are the infected enemies throughout the game. Our standard infected, also known as swarmers, are the lowest level of the mutation from the virus. They're still fully humanoid creatures that act aggressively and move in packs, called swarms, hence the name. They'll come at Deegan with melee swipes and grapple attacks, dealing out low damage with the potential to disable you in a fight. On their own, they're pretty easy to overpower, even pretty simple to handle in groups of up to 4 or 5. But that's when things get interesting with swarmers. When they swarm, they're a wave of pissed off flesh and blood, chasing you down until they take you down. The smaller groups of around 100 can be found throughout the entirety of the game, and taking them out is not a simple task without being thoroughly prepared. Without an automatic gun and a couple of explosives, you'd be hard-pressed to take out a swarm without cheating a bit by fleeing on your bike or pulling in some help from bandits or wildlife. Moving right along, we also have bleachers. I'm gonna kind of go in the order of least interesting to most interesting for the special infected to me, so if the order that I bring them up in seems strange to you, that's probably it. Anyways, bleachers. These are higher tier swarmers, identical in every way, but they have a bit more health and deal a little more damage. You can easily identify a bleacher with the color of their skin. Their strain of the mutation has caused severe albinism, which makes them look bleached. Crazy, right? I think these guys can sneak into swarms as a fun little surprise for the player, a slightly beefed up target in the mass of flesh, but again, they are otherwise identical in gameplay to the swarmers. Oh, one little trick that all the infected do, I didn't really know where to put this, but it makes sense here since I just covered the basic infected, and I think they're probably scripted to do it the most. They all do this little head wiggle dodge out of the way when you're aiming at them, and it's such a fun gimmick that I rolled my eyes every time one perfectly maneuvered out of the way. It's a really neat trick to make gunning down a group a little more interesting, especially when you just run out of focus lining up a perfect shot and suddenly they dodge and are right on top of you. Next up, we have newts. These guys are... Jesus, Deacon. Yeah, these are infected children with the Freaker virus. They move in little packs and avoid the player until you enter their territory, usually a high up place or nest somewhere in a building. I think the game also mentions that they'll pursue you if you're low on health around them, but I never noticed that behavior. When you get into their areas, they'll pounce on Deacon continuously, dealing low damage but constantly disabling the player and setting them up for repeated attacks. They're super weak though, with you being able to take them out in just a swing or two from a melee weapon, and they're pretty easy to just outright avoid if you don't want to deal with them since they stick to their nests. And next we have the Screamer. Pretty typical enemy type in a zombie game, these are the attractor type enemies. Their whole purpose is to bring in more trouble for the player. I think they have a melee attack if you get close enough, but usually they'll just scream, which deals continuous damage and slowly drains stamina. Once they're done screaming, they'll try to flee and do it again, forcing you to keep an eye on them to avoid bringing in constant reinforcements. They're easy to spot with their unique posture and long white hair, so picking them off from a distance before they get a chance to shout isn't too difficult. And for our last two, we have the Special Infected, or Boss Type Special Infected. These aren't segmented specifically as boss fights, except for their introductions, but they are the two most powerful and dangerous infecteds in the game. First we have the Breaker, our big, definitely not a tank infected. They're rumored to be swarmers that have had a unique interaction with the virus due to steroids in their system or considerably high testosterone, leading to their huge stature and increased physical strength. In combat, they're mostly bull rush enemies, meaning they charge the player in a straight line, attempting to do a powerful single attack. You can dodge this pretty easily with a dodge roll, so their main tactic isn't too scary once you get the timing down. They do have a basic melee combo which knocks Deacon back and deals a good amount of damage, but you can dodge that too. And they have a grapple attack too, forcing Deacon into a quick-time event to escape and dealing pretty considerable damage during the sequence even if you escape it. But it's also pretty easy to get out of the way of that one. Which kind of brings me to an issue I have with these bigger, stronger, single infected type encounters. The game was clearly designed for hordes, large-scale infected fights with Deke taking down hundreds of swarmers alone. So when you're faced against one big guy, the movement in the game makes fighting these things trivial. You can dodge his slow, lumbering attacks because your moveset isn't made for that. It's here to move out of the way of pounces and for Deacon to stay moving forward, again making these encounters not as intense as they could be, which is a shame because having a variety in the infected types is absolutely welcome, and I appreciate what they're trying to do. It's just the execution with Deacon's movement that makes them fall flat, unfortunately. These are attempted to be mitigated throughout the game with having multiple of the bigger infected guys in a fight, but they're so slow they're still pretty easy to dodge, so fighting 3 breakers never felt any different than fighting a few swarmers with more health. Lastly, for the breakers, they are aggressive to anything in front of them, meaning they will fight other infected if they're around. I like this. I think it makes the encounters with them interesting by diverting a swarm or horde and potentially splintering off to divide the player's attention. So this is all a positive from me. I think this could be improved with the breakers prioritizing Deacon in a fight while still being aggressive to the infected, pursuing the player slowly, pushing through the horde, willingly attacking and killing swarmers to reach them. I don't know, just sounds cool. And our last special infected, the other double special guy, is the Reacher. These are the ones in the narrative section that I said I chuckled at the reveal, cause, I mean, look at them. That's kind of a ridiculous design to try and take seriously. They're the latest evolution of the Freaker virus, and they fill out the role of a super fast infected of the game, being able to run up to 40 miles an hour. Apparently, I never saw them chase me down on my bike like that. They're aggressive and have quick combos and pouncing attacks, dealing high damage very quickly. The same issue that breakers have arise when fighting just one of them. Their attacks are easily avoided and kind of nullify the excitement of fighting them, but at least they're also faster than breakers, so it's a little harder to dodge their attacks. They also have a habit of fleeing the fight when you get them low on health, which I think is a fun quirk. Again, like the Screamers, they try to avoid you to find another opportunity to strike, potentially diverting your attention during an active fight. But that's not all of the enemies in the game. I hear you begin typing in the comments. What about the animals? Yeah, I'm gonna talk about the animals too. Throughout the game, you can encounter a couple of different types of wildlife, like deer, wolves, bears, cougars, and some birds. I think that's all of them, actually. Anyways, all of them, except for the deer, are aggressive towards Deacon if you get close enough with melee attacks to stagger and pouncing attacks to force an escape sequence. Their lethality varies. Obviously a bear is going to be a much scarier matchup than a wolf, but the wolf usually roams in packs. And much like the Reacher, cougars avoid the player when they're hit and try to retaliate when they find an opening. I like the inclusion of animals in the open world. It makes the world seem more alive, and it makes sense that these wild animals would be roaming around more with less people to bother them. And much like those people, the animals here in Oregon are susceptible to the Freaker virus. There's 3 infected animals: runners, infected wolves, ragers, infected bears, and criers, infected crows. The runners and ragers aren't very different from their normal, non-infected counterparts, just dealing more damage and having more health. I think the runners are actually faster than regular wolves. These things definitely caught me on my bike, more often at least. The criers, the infected crows, are wholly unique though. They have nests throughout the last region of the game and can only be found around these nests. When driving or walking by, they will dive down on Deacon, dealing minimal damage, but they often attack in succession. They go down very easily, but the real way to take care of them is by burning their nests. By burning a nest, all the local criers will scatter and no longer be a threat. I like the inclusion of infected animals too. I think it's an interesting consideration that not a lot of zombie media approaches, and I think that what they're doing here is fun. Obviously, the infected variants could stand to be a little more unique, but without going completely off the rails, I think what's in the game is fine. And for very last, these guys aren't so much a special infected type on their own, but I want to classify them separate from the rest. We have hordes. I mentioned it above, but these are groups of swarmers and bloaters in the hundreds. These act as post-game content for you to tackle once you're fully geared and leveled up to be prepared to take them down, and you'll need that gear and skill. They're massive waves of enemies that move as a unified threat to rip you apart. They're very fun and exciting counters that expect you to effectively train and kite them through the environment. If you've played high rounds on Keynote or Toten, you'll feel right at home. You really have to throw everything you have at them, mowing them down when you have a break, tossing grenades, placing traps, and occasionally using the environmental interactions. I do think there's a bit of an imbalance in some hordes against others with the environment. Some hordes have dedicated spaces with a lot of fun interactions to be found, like knocking down obstacles or bridges for the horde to fall through, and others are just out in an open field, which is not nearly as interesting. Overall though, the hordes are the best gameplay content the game has to offer. This is what you were sold on with the reveal of the game, and I think they meet the expectation. And I think making these hordes part of the post-game content is one of the boldest moves Days Gone pulls, and I think it actually lands somehow. Narratively, we've been built up to the hordes, and through gameplay, we've reached a point where we can actually fight back against enemies on this scale. So, despite the hordes being a main staple of the marketing for the game, I think hordes being slated as post-game content was the right move. And I think that's it for what I have to say on enemy types throughout the game, which I think is a pretty solid lineup. There's some issues with the approaches to certain enemies like I mentioned. One-on-one fights with infected aren't very exciting, and human enemies could stand to be a little smarter, but otherwise, yeah, it's a decently diverse cast on top of the main course of large-scale infected encounters. I don't think Days Gone strays too far from the zombie game bible of what to include, but they do it on a larger scale, which makes the real meat of combat exciting and fun. Moving around the world of Days Gone is one of the best and most unique aspects of the game as a whole. The movement in the world is entirely based around Deacon's motorcycle, an upgradable bike that carries you through the beginning of the game all the way to the end. The bike is a crucial part of player progression and again made a lot of fun to use to navigate through the world. Driving the motorcycle feels great. It has a lot of heft to its movement, creating a very believable but not too realistic simulation of drifting over the highway or hitting bumps down a mountain path. The bike is your only means of moving through the world quickly, and I think that's an excellent decision to make you feel attached to your vehicle. And you will be attached to it because if you run out of gas or manage to beat the thing up too much, the bike will break down and force you to search for gasoline or stop for repairs, leaving you stranded out in the shit. Repairing your bike requires scrap, a resource you can scavenge throughout the world, and refueling the bike obviously needs gasoline, both of which are found frequently and sufficiently even on the survival difficulty I played through on. One consideration for managing the fuel in your bike is being able to disengage the clutch and allow your bike to coast down hills, and you can shift your weight to extend the momentum, which I absolutely love. I think coasting on the bike is a skill that you learn throughout playing Days Gone and makes it a very unique interaction when you move throughout the world. Unfortunately, here's another tangent on that improvised gameplay. As you progress in the game, you'll have so much money that you'll be able to buy gasoline to fill up your tank or pay for repairs so frequently that neither will be much of a consideration around the midpoint of the game till the end, which I think really harms that opportunity for unexpected stops when you have to spend a few minutes slow and exposed to hunt down a gas can so you can finally coast back into camp. You can also drive other bikes you find in the world, but they can't be repaired or refueled, I think. So obviously you'll want to stick to your own, and other than the mechanical incentive to your bike, you can fully customize your motorcycle and upgrade various parts to make it leagues better than any scrapper you find in the wild. You can change the paint job, the metal frame, add some decals, change the fenders and headlights and handlebars, and more. The bike is the main component of player expression in Days Gone, and I think it does a pretty good job. I change the visuals of my bike frequently, with some different camps throughout the map having different customization options, so I was happy to throw on a new paint job when I saw one or to mess with some pieces to give it a new look. But if I'm being honest, I was just playing for time until I got to where I can put on the Death Stranding parts. The customization suite here is good, and I think it's a great in-world way to allow the player some expression when Deacon as a character is more set in stone. And like I mentioned, you can also upgrade the bike past changing its visuals, being able to upgrade parts like the engine, the fuel tank, your brakes, and even adding a nitrous boost. All of these upgrades are extremely tangible movements towards having a very powerful vehicle, so even the smallest mid-level upgrade to a component will be something you immediately notice. I love upgrading the bike because it feels so important. You'll notice the change in how much damage your bike can take when you install some shock absorbers, or you'll feel how much faster you're moving down the highway with a new engine. The upgrades are probably the biggest money sink in the game, other than new weapons, and I think that's a great way to make the upgrades feel important. While you're on the bike, you're also open to vehicular combat. I don't think it's particularly exciting, but I do appreciate the inclusion to give you some more freedom while driving. While on the road, Deacon can ready his sidearm to lock onto targets nearby, slowly gaining accuracy over time and even becoming a lethal shot if you wait long enough until it's fully focused. I don't really like that the mounted combat is forced to an auto-lock system, but I guess I do understand the design based around the original PlayStation launch and aiming with a controller. But I would still love to see a system with free aim and optional soft target locking if it's needed. The auto-targeting can get a little awkward with cycling through multiple nearby enemies, which really pushes my desire for being able to freely aim. I think it would have been fun to be able to use improvised melee weapons on the bike as well, sacrificing a lot of the durability for big, heaving swings that knock out enemies, which I think would be a fun alternative to the current system in the game for enemies lunging at Deacon while you're driving. As it stands, when an enemy leaps at the player, if you have a specific skill unlocked, you get prompted with a QuickTime event to quickly react and shoot the enemy away. I think this is fine as a defensive option, but I really would have enjoyed to see this expanded with what I mentioned before, like being able to whack a runner mid-jump if you time it right, avoiding the QuickTime sequence entirely. As a whole, I love the bike and its focus in the gameplay. It's one of the most unique aspects of Days Gone, focusing you on a single vehicle type and a single vehicle at that, upgrading your ride and tricking you through gameplay systems to appreciate it. I wish there was even more consideration for how handling the motorcycle was made unique, like coasting down hills to conserve fuel, but I can understand that the progression of the game might not hamper the experience for everyone, and it could just be a me thing with my desire for gameplay based around my suffering. Maybe I'm just a masochist and like the struggle when I play a game. Might be getting closer to the truth now that I've written that out. I've mentioned a couple of things about the progression systems in Days Gone so far, mostly how they lessen the presence of emergent gameplay throughout the game, but let's dig a little deeper into what progression is available and how it affects the play experience. I've already talked about how your bike can be improved and customized, so naturally the other half of the core progression is improving Deacon. Throughout the game, you gain XP, or experience points, for a few things, completing missions, killing anything, and participating in open-world content. When you gain enough XP, you level up, awarding the player with a skill point to spend across 3 skill trees, a melee, ranged, and survival tree. The melee tree focuses around improving melee combat. Shocker, I know. There's skills to improve improvised melee weapon durability, increase Deacon's combo length, gaining stamina from melee hits, and even skills to unlock new melee attacks, like a sprinting attack that guarantees a knockdown on smaller enemies and that you then can follow up with an instant kill. The melee tree is undoubtedly useful to invest in since melee combat is a constant through gameplay. It's always there for you to fall back on, so improving your performance is an obvious choice. The ranged skill tree is just as straightforward, with skills to improve how you handle ranged weapons. The skills here give you increased accuracy, allow you to sprint while reloading, increase ammo capacities, and there's a couple of skills to improve the focus ability, on top of one to unlock the ability. With these skills, the focus ability can become a very powerful tool, like increasing your bullet penetration while in focus to rip through enemy armor. As a whole, the ranged skill tree is also an obvious thing to continuously level up, probably more so than the melee tree since ranged combat is more enjoyable to engage with. Lastly, we have the survival tree. It's a pretty generalized name for some generalized skills, giving you things like quieter footsteps while sneaking, increasing the efficiency of repairing your motorcycle, and doubling the amount of crafting materials you can hold on your person. I think a lot of the survival skills available are pretty useless. The ones I mentioned are actually the decent ones, if you can believe it. There's stuff in here like highlighting open world plant pickups on your minimap and increasing the harvest yields from butchering animals or collecting herbs. Yes, separate skills for each. I don't think the survival skill tree holds up to the other two, with the others again surrounding core gameplay mechanics. I think a lot of the survival tree would be fine as one-time purchasable upgrades from a camp merchant, to then allow for some skill points to be freed up to the other useful skill trees, and I think that helped with the overabundance of currency you'll have in the late game too. And with that overabundant currency, let me complain some more about how these skills ruin the fun for me through getting rid of that emergent gameplay. The skills that allow you to carry more items or ammo, and skills that allow you to sit back and ignore your supplies are the ones I have an issue with. Being able to repair your bike with less scrap makes those repairs fewer and further between than the early game. I had a couple of moments early on where I could just barely get my bike running so I could gently drive the rest of the way to camp. Moments like that are diminished when a single piece of scrap adds a quarter of the durability, and the same goes for being able to carry more supplies and ammo. Like I've mentioned, having so much ammo in those higher tier guns makes it so you'll never want to pick up another gun, even if you wanted to. You'll always have a surplus of ammo around, so there won't be an opportunity for you to run out, unless you're really mowing down your targets. The same goes for the increase to your crafting supplies for very similar reasons. You'll be less interested in looting because you'll probably be full of whatever you can pick up, and you can't craft anything anyways because you've already made everything you can. There's an obvious solution here for me that you might be shouting at the screen. Just don't get those skills and upgrades, right? But is a good solution to ruining an interesting gameplay loop to tell someone not to engage with the systems they're presented with. I don't think so. I think ignoring gameplay systems and mechanics just to try to make your experience better is a roundabout way of not experiencing what the game is trying to feed you. There's no build variety in Days Gone, it's a mostly linear progression system, so opting out of those skills would be opting out of something the game wants to give you directly. So I don't think that's a great argument, but I understand that some people are happy to ignore what a game is trying to give you for the sake of their enjoyment. I'm just not one of those people. I want to see what a game has to offer me to the fullest extent I can, even if it dampens some of my enjoyment. To round out the progression available to the player, there are 30 collectible Nero injectors defined throughout the world. Each one of these injectors allows the player to opt into one of 3 stats to increase: health, stamina, and focus, with 10 available upgrades for each. These are handed out pretty steadily throughout the game and given out very heavily towards the end, but I think the progression of these stats is pretty comfortable. Since you can pick what gets increased each time, you're able to choose to upgrade whatever you think you're struggling with. For instance, I chose stamina almost every time until it was maxed out because I was running out of stamina during longer engagements frequently. With collecting these being optional, I guess you could say there's another layer of optional difficulty you could engage with, like neglecting the skills I mentioned above, but I don't really know why you'd do that. Hey, this section of the video is labeled progression and crafting, so let's talk about crafting. It's a very streamlined, ease-of-use focused system with you only needing to enter a radial menu and cycling to a tab to find what you want to craft. Though you do need to get the recipe for the item you want to craft beforehand. These are given out through the story and for completing some open world activities, and I believe each recipe is given out for specific instances, not in a randomized pool, which unfortunately makes some of the unlocks pretty underwhelming to me. I really wanted to make my own pipe bombs throughout the game, but I wasn't able to until the very end of Act 2. But every time I cleared a bandit camp, you better believe I got a new crossbow bolt for me to craft for the crossbow that I didn't like using. I don't think a random pool of items would feel better to dole out. Maybe I wouldn't have gotten that pipe bomb till the post-game. But I don't know, maybe purchasable recipes would have been a better option? Getting recipes for things I knew I would not be crafting never felt like a satisfying reward, so being able to control what you learn to craft might have been a more player satisfaction-oriented solution, and again, another money sink to help the game's economy. Anyways, back to what you can craft. I mentioned them already, but you can create things like various crossbow bolts, bombs, healing items, and traps. Each item takes specific materials to craft, which you can find throughout the world and loot off of dead enemies. I think this is fine. The items you can create are well-rounded, like I said briefly in the combat section. Each item has a use case and it does what it needs to. The items you scavenge for crafting are, again, overabundant in my opinion, with enemy loot being something you can outright ignore if you aren't crafting frequently and heavily. Items you pick up in the world do take a few in-game days to respawn, but since you're moving around so much, it'll feel like they come back instantly and you'll be able to make all the Molotovs you'd ever want. A quick fun note about the in-world pickups: new items will begin to appear in the world as you unlock new recipes. I don't know if it just starts spawning them in loot pools once you unlock them, or that they actually become highlighted and lootable, but I hope it's the latter, because I think that'd be a cool detail. As a whole, I don't really have any real negatives to the quick crafting system and the items that you make. Like I said, I don't like the progression of unlocking crafting recipes, and I do think you have too many materials to craft in a supposedly post-apocalyptic, resource-scarce setting, but both of those are very personal gripes. I like how fluidly the crafting happens, and I employed a lot of the items through my playthrough, so yeah, I guess it's mostly fine. Oh, one last quick note on the progression here. You get rewards for completing what the game calls storylines, essentially threads for main missions and side content that are tracked in one flow. Like the storyline in Act 1 of helping Boozer with his infection is separate from Boozer's storyline once he's recovered. The rewards vary in their usefulness, and unfortunately, the useful ones come less frequently. Most of the time you get paint jobs for your bike, but sometimes you get crafting recipes, and sometimes you get new weapons. I think locking these down to just the more tangible rewards could have helped me be more excited about storyline completion, but I also think there's a bit of bloat with how many storylines are presented at once. It can kind of feel overwhelming when you finish a mission and are told you just progressed 6 different threads, even if it doesn't really mean anything until you get 100% completion for the storyline. So, to wrap this section up, I think the progression in the game is good, but it definitely detracts from the most enjoyable gameplay that I find in Days Gone. The skills you obtain are absolutely useful and can even be fun to use, but some of the upgrades take away from the potential of improvised gameplay, which is personally my favorite way to experience playing, though I don't think you should ignore any systems just because it'll be harder. I think the same goes for crafting. It's fine and even enjoyable when applying your crafted items correctly, but an overabundance leads to a lack of engagement when you don't see the need to loot because you're already full on supplies. Days Gone is a massive game, spanning across 6 separate regions in Central Oregon which are slowly unlocked and revealed to the player as you progress through the story. It's also massive in the amount of content in the game. You probably noticed with how long it took me to cover the main campaign, and there's a lot to do in Days Gone, but unfortunately I think it's a lot of quantity over quality. But there is undeniably an effort to making the open world content rewarding. Starting off, you have two different types of side missions throughout the game. You'll be sent on bounty hunts and bandit camp clearing. Both of these play out very similarly. You head to a location and kill some guys, sometimes only requiring one specific guy that needs to be killed. For bounties, this can change occasionally, with you being asked to take in the bounty alive, which always means you'll chase them down on your bike and shoot their vehicle until it boots them off. And bounties will also have you sometimes following a trail to physically track the target using Deacon's survivor vision thing. It really isn't relevant, so I haven't mentioned it, but he has like a Witcher sense or detective vision, whatever you want to call it. Both of these mission types can also be disguised as main missions, and when they are, it's usually just to represent the passage of time. So I don't mind that necessarily, but it did confuse me a bit while taking notes for this playthrough, and it definitely took me a while to stop paying attention to the snippets of storytelling in these missions. Usually the story surrounding a bounty hunt or bandit camp is that someone came to whatever camp is employing you and did something wrong to them, so now they're wanted dead, sometimes alive. What does separate these two mission types are their rewards. I mentioned it a second ago, but bandit camps are guaranteed to give you a crafting recipe. They hide these recipes in underground bunkers that are always found in their mission-specific camps. You can also use these bunkers to access your gun locker and sleep too. I think they also become fast travel points. Bounty hunts do not give you a tangible reward, but they do dish out money and trust for settlements, which I'll get into here in a second. Before I go on a bit of a tangent about the missions as a whole, I do want to highlight something that Days Gone does really well with its side content. I don't really know how to phrase this, but the side content in the game is presented to the player in a cohesive way. Like when you have to ride back to a certain region for the story, usually some new side missions pop up as well. It might be because I can't fast travel on survival difficulty, but this felt like a great consideration for the player and how you move through the world, so I thought it was worth mentioning. Anyways, I don't really like either of these mission types. I just wish there was more done with each of them with how many there are to complete. Bandit camps always have around 10 to 15 guys in the camp, sometimes throwing in reinforcements at you to bring it up to around 20, and bounty hunts are either a bike chase or a bandit camp disguised with a priority target. I don't really know how I'd improve on either without an entire overhaul, but I think a simpler way to improve on them would be to have an overarching story for both, like the bandit camps belonging to a specific bandit group. Sometimes they do belong to rippers or anarchists, but rippers are handled through the story and anarchists are just basic enemies in a different font. Maybe all the bandits could be focused around the anarchists, with a big finale camp being their headquarters like the Rippers in the story, a large-scale encounter that throws a mass of human enemies at you. And having something similar with the bounties could go a long way too. Sometimes they are continuations of a side story with references to each other, but that only lasts 2 missions at most. Maybe the bounties could all be capture targets instead of kill targets to make them focused on the bike combat instead of repeating the bandit camp invasion. To mix it up, maybe you have to draw them out of hiding sometimes at camps, which then leads to the bike chase. I don't know. Obviously I'm just spitballing ideas, but as the made side content stands, it's pretty stagnant and they could use some more weight to feel more worthwhile. While you're out on the road, you can also come across Nero checkpoints. These are very quick and simple environmental puzzles, and I say puzzle very loosely, to unlock a mobile medical unit to claim the Nero injector inside. These are surprisingly fun to move through, not because finding the gas can or fuse is interesting, but because activating the generator of the checkpoint can bring in a lot of infected if you don't handle the checkpoint properly. There are speakers in the area that you can disable to avoid calling unwanted attention, so there's an added layer in how prepared you are for unlocking the mobile unit. These are entirely optional, but always contain those injectors, which are the only way to increase your 3 primary stats, so they're pretty good to track down and complete. On top of Nero checkpoints, there are also Nero research stations. These are smaller scale locations that give you an injector and some lore on the freaks from a micro recorder, usually in hard to read places or inside nests, so you have to visit them while the freaks are out. These are fine. They bolster the amount of injectors you get without having the extended checkpoint sequences, so I don't mind their inclusion. Another thing you'll find regularly throughout the world are freak nests, separate from the ones that have Nero research stations. These are nests that take up buildings, the undersides of bridges, or some other enclosed space. They're burned out very quickly by fire, like with a Molotov or incendiary crossbow bolt, and then you're expected to gun down the freaks that were hiding inside. There's a bunch of these all over the map, and clearing them out makes traveling a lot safer, so I think they're worth your time too. And within nest zones, there are usually swarms, so you get some of that large-scale infected content early on if you hunt them down. Speaking of large-scale infected content, we also have hordes. I mentioned it briefly, but hordes are entirely endgame content, with the exception of 3 hordes in the main story. I talked about hordes at length in the infected section of the video, but just to cover my bases, these are massive groups of hordes up to the hundreds that expect you to mow them down and blow them up in one go. They're probably the reason you bought Days Gone, and they live up to the excitement. Fighting hordes is the best expression of skill and power in the game, which makes them very fun to overcome. And I think that does it for side content throughout the game, at least in the main game. There are some extra modes that I'll talk about in a bit if you're wondering about those. Much like the human enemies versus the freaks in my summary of the combat, I think the human-based side content is lacking compared to freak content. While both are mostly generic objectives to clear X or kill Y amount of enemies, the freaks are backed by more enjoyable gameplay, which inherently makes their combat more engaging to play. The human-based side content could use that human element like I mentioned, creating a story out of the side content, but as it stands, they're all pretty similar objectives that end up blending together. And that kind of stands for all the scripted content throughout Days Gone, side missions or the main campaign. All missions tend to be go to place, kill some goons, return from place for a cutscene. I don't really have an idea for what could be more engaging content with the systems here. There isn't a whole lot to do with the sandbox of Days Gone to employ during these missions. I guess I would say utilizing the systems we have more frequently could help, using the motorcycle for chases or races, and please don't lynch me when I say this, even going as far as having more mandatory stealth could mix up gameplay. I do think the open world itself is interesting though. Progressing through it and having an impact on the world is one of the most interesting parts of Days Gone. There's a tangible feeling to how safe the world feels based on how much you engage with the side content, which I think is what makes it interesting to engage with. Clearing out freak nests, hordes, or bandit camps all make the world safer, which I think is an interesting consideration to make the side content interesting and helps the game feel more engaging where this lackluster side content would drag a game down normally. Lastly, for the open world, we have settlements, human encampments set up throughout the world. I think there's a settlement in each region, except one for narrative reasons, and there'll be safe havens for you and Deacon from being out in the wilderness. At a settlement, you can speak to a couple of different people. Primarily, you'll talk to the mission giver who doles out those bounties and bandit contracts, but there's a couple of vendors you can interact with too. First up, we have the merchants. These guys sell guns, ammo, and supplies at the cost of camp credits, allowing you to stock up and gear up for whatever you're heading out into. They also occasionally sell weapon upgrades for specific guns. These are probably the guys I would expect to sell recipes if they were given out like I mentioned before. Each camp also has a mechanic. They can repair and refuel your bike for a pretty low fee, and they're your means of upgrading the bike. At least at some camps. Sometimes mechanics only fuel and repair, and sometimes the merchant only sells ammo, which leads me to the next currency you'll need to buy things with: trust. Along with credits, each camp has a level of trust you have to build before you can buy certain things. With no trust, you can just fill your ammo and bike. At level 1, you can begin to buy things, and at the final level of trust, you'll have access to their entire stock. Most activities through the world gain trust and credits, usually tied to whatever region you're completing the activity in, so gaining both is pretty easy to come by. There are some encounters in the world where you can choose where a survivor checks into, which allows you to pick where you'll net some cash and trust. Lastly, for trust and credits, you can check in with the bounty board and kitchen, turning in freak bits or herbs and animal meats at each respectively. I think the trust system is a good way to pace out the progression of the player, with higher tier items being tied to high trust levels, so you'll have to engage with a lot of the content to be able to access them. I also think it's fun that certain camps sell certain things, or even outright don't have access to specific resources like bike upgrades. It's an interesting way to gauge the player on what they value. Do you send a survivor to Tucker's camp knowing it's a prison work camp just so you can buy a gun, or do you send them off to Copeland's Martial Law Fun Center so you can upgrade your bike? I think there being further ramifications for these decisions could be interesting, but I don't know what they could affect further with the systems in place. Maybe camps could hear Deacon working for the others and hike up the prices, and the camp gives a discount if you continually support them. I don't know, having consequences for these decisions interests me, and again, I do like making tough decisions in games, so this could just be me here. But as a whole, my opinion on the open world content makes my recommending of Days Gone kinda interesting, right? I said I loved this game, but the majority of the side content in your playthrough feels like filler until the post-game, and by that point you might be exhausted from the 40-hour journey that tasted the same as those side missions you just finished. I've probably said it too much at this point, but Days Gone is exceptional for its world and your interactions with it, apparently even more so than the secondary content crafted for you. Moving through the world, existing in rural Oregon, fighting against whatever's thrown at you makes Days Gone special, along with Deacon and his story of course, not so much the rinse and repeat enemy encampments and constant kill quests. The additional challenge modes in Days Gone really surprised me. I think it was a post-launch update, but here I am talking about the game 6 years post-launch, so I think it's relevant for the video. There's 12 challenges in total, and they're all a unique mix of the gameplay formula found in the base game. Each one is an instance mission that has you tackle a unique challenge, like racing to a specific point as fast as possible or taking on a horde in an enclosed space. But they get a little more interesting from there. Each challenge has a scoring system tied to it based on your performance and specific objectives made for the challenge, like getting explosive kills during the infestation challenge or having a lot of airtime on your bike during some of the racing missions. Just completing the challenges won't guarantee a high score, so going for these extra objectives during a run is how you'll secure a passing grade and maybe even a gold medal for the highest completion. Completing challenges also gives you patches, essentially additional perks, which are added to your character both in the challenge mode and the base game, with each patch getting upgraded with the higher completion level you reach for a challenge. This was a pleasant surprise for me when I was looking into the mode. You can get permanent increases to your character in the base game for these, like health increases, higher bullet penetration, better fuel efficiency in your bike, and more. These are some seriously nice bonuses for someone looking for total completion of the game, and it's a nice touch that they actually get represented in-game on Deacon's model. While playing through the challenge mode, you can also opt into rings, which also act as perks, but these are exclusive to the challenge runs, and you can only equip 2 at a time. These are like character modifiers for you to exploit during a run, like headshots making you more accurate over time or performing vaults while sprinting to give you back stamina. They're fun bonuses and they're unlocked slowly through the progression inside the challenge mode. Speaking of, within the challenge menu you can earn XP from runs and currency to unlock more customization options and rings for you to use during your challenge attempts. Higher tier rings and, frankly, more interesting characters for you to play as require a higher challenge level and cost more challenge credits naturally, but it's again fun to see some consideration for a simple arcadey mode in an otherwise serious game. You can play as most major characters throughout the game: Boozer, Sarah, Ricky, Deacon with his shirt off, all of the most memorable parts of the cast, and yeah, again, it's fun to see Days Gone take itself a little less seriously. I really enjoy some of the challenges. The Survive challenge is a super condensed version of that improvised gameplay I can't seem to shut up about, and the Dead Before Daylight challenge is a fun take on horde gameplay, asking you to stay inside a small hotel to fight a horde to keep your score up. Honestly, I'm surprised the challenge mode was a free update. It's a really neat addition to the game, and the base game benefits make it worth checking out to beef up Deacon if you're looking for a little more power or efficiency. Plus, it's honestly just fun. I hopped on to record myself playing the challenges just for some background footage, and 2 hours immediately flew by. On top of the challenge mode, the game also features New Game Plus. I didn't delve into the mode because I figured it would just worsen the early game experience for me even further, but it's a nice inclusion for someone that might be interested. New Game Plus modes are sort of becoming the norm in games, and I like them enough, so it's neat to see it represented here. If you are unfamiliar, New Game Plus is an option to start a new save file from the beginning of the game with all of your character upgrades present from the beginning. In Days Gone's case, that means all of your skill tree purchases, bike upgrades, Nero injections, your guns, trust and credit levels, and crafting recipes. So I imagine it's a fun way to rush through the game with a maxed out Deacon, but it just didn't interest me very much. Days Gone is a beautiful game. I can say that wholeheartedly. It is an amazing render of rural Oregon with varied environments from high deserts, swamps, marshes, and forests, all with that post-apocalyptic touch. I'm a sucker for a post-apocalyptic setting. I think the perversion of the world we know really interests me in a visual language, and I think Days Gone nails it with overgrowth, broken highways, piled up cars, and destroyed buildings. It really is a fantastic looking game on a macro level, and even up close and personal. Everything is rendered in a realistic art style in a high fidelity, making it still one of the best looking games I've ever played. And that's not to mention all the detail in the world, from impressive weather systems where you can watch clouds roll in and become a storm to the detail of a camp with their sleeping quarters, guard towers, and farm. Everything in Days Gone is impressive to look at, and I want to circle back to the weather specifically. The weather throughout the game is really impressive, visually and on a technical level. I don't think I've seen such realistic looking blizzard or fog that looks so natural in a game, and it kind of catches you off guard in this game that's supposed to be a bleak look at the end of the world, which further extends to the environments as a whole. I just mentioned it before, but man, this game really nails the cramped feeling you get in the forest or the loneliness of a desert all in one massive play area for you to drive around. And it's a weird thing, but Days Gone has some of the most natural feeling interiors I've ever seen in a game. It's strange, a lot of games get the sense of scale off when you compare your character to their surroundings, like seeming massive compared to a door frame or furniture, but everything feels realistic here and it's a great attention to detail. Another thing I love about the environments of the game is the cohesion of the world's space when it moves you between locations. Driving to another region usually has you passing through a tunnel through a mountain, a tunnel full of wrecked cars, freak nests, and ambushes, and they feel so lived in and believable that I honestly love having to slow down to pass through the wreckage. Again, I think this game is fully appreciated when you play without the fast travel because you are seriously missing out on a great world if you decide to warp around the map. And that's the macro level of the visual presentation. What about the micro details? Characters, animations, effects, that kind of thing. It's all mostly good. Characters consistently look good. I think most, if not all, of the main cast is modeled after their actors and they're rendered in fantastic detail. Everyone looks great. Some more minor NPCs, like the ones you encounter for random events, look a little off, but I think that's mostly because of the canned animations for dialogue outside of cutscenes, which all look pretty bad. Cutscenes for the game were motion captured, probably all of them, and it pays off. The game has a real cinematic feel when you're watching a cutscene, but that definitely shows its hand in the inverse. When a scene isn't motion captured, characters move in awkward, stilted motions through dialogue, and it feels very out of place with the high fidelity the game has otherwise. And I want to give a special shout out to Deacon St. John's design specifically. There's a lot to unpack just looking at Deacon physically, from his tattoos covering his body to his many patches across his mongrel vest. Each tattoo, each patch, each part of what he's wearing feels like an intentional choice not only by the designers that created him, but by a person like he's a real guy that dresses this way in the apocalypse. And I can't forget Deke's motorcycle. It slowly becomes a real bike you can trust through the game, and I love how the upgrades are visually represented. Your bike really looks better by the end of the game. And just for a fun little detail, your bike that you customize appears on the main menu throughout the game at the nearest camp to where you left off. It's a nice touch of personalization. As for our freaks, I think they look pretty good too. There's a lot of detail to their models, though only a few variations, which I understand. You're not really going to make out a whole lot of detail on the freaks when you're gunning them down by the dozen. They look good though, in that weird zombie design you'd want to see. Their muscles and veins are bulging and they're emaciated from being out in the elements so long. They're thoroughly gross. And there's special consideration for the special infected, each with their own unique design to make them stand out from the common freaks, each looking great too. Other than the Reacher. I really can't get over how silly this guy looks. He looks like someone's grandpa answering the door. Infected animals look great as well. I never really got a close look at the criers though. Ragers, the infected bears, have this really cool variant where they're covered in a bunch of debris like barbed wire and fence posts. Love that extra detail. And since you'll be looking at them a lot, I think the freaks highlight some great animation. They clamber over each other, lunge and leap and pounce at Deacon, and they run like they have no consideration for their well-being, and they're a blast to watch in action. Deacon and others look great in motion too. They move with a lot of purpose and heft. I think where the care for animation really shines though is the bike. That thing looks and feels like it's trudging through the snow and going through hell to get me away from a horde. And I love that the animations for the bike change as its condition goes down, like the wheels wobbling with movement. And guns look great too. There's a really fun variety of weapons like I mentioned above, a lot of weird guns, which is really cool. There's a lever action rifle, a lot of World War II era guns, a 7-barrel break action shotgun, a revolver carbine, and more, and they're all animated thoroughly, which leaves a great impression for each feeling unique. Moving on to visual effects throughout the game, I think they're all pretty good too. Fire looks great, bellowing and burning in the environment, smoke clouds up and disperses in a believable way, and your bike kicks up enough mud and dirt that I can buy it. I think the lighting in the game is where visual effects really breathe, creating intense environments and scenes. Like the mission with Schizo that's lit by flares, these caves feel intense and ominous, or anytime you fire a gun inside at night. The muzzle flash lights up the room, and I think I might have to put an epilepsy warning on screen to show how intense it is. The lighting in the game is really impressive, and it's only bolstered by the rest of the game in motion. The HUD and user interface throughout Days Gone is pretty uninspired. I'd say it's probably the weakest aspect of the presentation, but behind the great visuals and solid audio we'll get into in a second, that's not necessarily a huge detraction for the game. I want to preface again that I played through the game on survival difficulty, which disables most of the HUD until I prompt the HUD to pop up when I enter Survivor Vision, or whatever it's called, so my impression of it is mostly coming from when I played the challenge mode. And just to say it up front, I think the HUD is really ugly. In the bottom left, you have your health, stamina, and ammo indicator. It's got a very blocky, compact, and minimal design that doesn't feel like it suits the game in my opinion. Everything is squared out and rectangular, even your ammo indicator, which I really dislike. It feels so out of place having this massive HUD element with each bullet in the magazine section out. It feels very over-designed. On top of that, there's the constant outline of the gun you're using next to it. Man, I hate it. Anyways, yeah, overall it's all blocky and ugly to me. I don't really know what I'd expect for the HUD in the game, but it feels so out of place for a biker in the post-apocalypse. It feels like a very corporate design. Underneath the health bar though are some quick indicators for some of your inventory, which I actually like. They're very legible and quick to understand what they represent. Health items, amount of scrap, your flashlight indicator, and so on. Down in the corner here, you'll also get inventory updates like when you loot a specific item for crafting, which I don't mind. It's quick and readable, and that's all it needs to be. In the bottom right of the screen, we have a radar and detection indicator, again going with an over-designed look in my opinion. Does this game really need a noise indicator? If I'm crouched and walking, I know I'm pretty quiet, and if I'm driving my bike and pulling the clutch, I'm sure it's loud. And same goes with the visual indicator. Do I need to know that yes, since I'm in the bush, they can't see me? I can already gather that from the field of view pulling back to represent it. And the radar, man, I hate this thing. It's mostly an enemy directional indicator, showing you where enemies are approaching from and how close they are to you, which is fine for Halo or something, not really relevant or useful in a single player game. The radar does draw a path for you in the game world to follow for navigation, which I relied on frequently since you drive down a lot of winding forest paths, but otherwise I think it's pretty useless. It also shows you where your bike is, enemies that can be looted, and plants that can be harvested with the perk I mentioned earlier. I think the bike and harvestable lootables could have been mitigated with in-world indicators like highlighting bodies or your bike when you prompt biker vision mode. Moving along, the top left corner gives you objective updates and summaries, which I don't mind, it looks fine and the information is always relevant. I do like that without the radar there are in-world indicators for mission objectives so you can kinda just ride to wherever you're heading without watching the roads and constantly checking the bottom right corner. Throughout the game, anywhere on the screen, you can have some in-world indicators for pickups and items you can interact with, which I really like. They feel very physical, like how the prompt to repair your bike is wrapped around the engine and the fuel gauge is right on top of the tank. It's nice and I really like this decision. And lastly, we have the survival wheel. I think the game actually calls it that, not a joke from me. It's the radial menu you use to select items quickly in gameplay, picking your gun, crafting some healing items, or choosing a bomb to throw. It's fine, it's clearly designed with a controller in mind, but easy enough to navigate with a mouse, which I use to play through the game with. There's 8 spokes of the radial menu, each corner representing a separate sub-menu you can enter for crafting, and I think it all works well enough without overwhelming the player since items get added throughout the game. Moving on to the overall user interface throughout the game, the menus actually look pretty good, I think. There's a minimal design to them. I know I just went on a rant about the HUD being minimal, but the menus have a clear intent behind it. Like with the inventory, there's a lot of white space on screen, but that space is used to show you what parts of the menu you can interact with, while the left side has a shot of a bike. And that's consistent for every menu in the game. They focus on the interactive elements for clear readability and some art to accompany it. The in-game map shares this design philosophy with any unexplored area being blanked out and filled in with a physicalized landscape map. I like the map, it looks nice. I think the fog of war effect slowly uncovering the map is fun and I don't have much else to say. As a whole, the UI and HUD in the game is a pretty mixed bag, which makes me even more thankful that I played the game without it both times I played through Days Gone. Thankfully, the audio throughout the game has mostly high marks from me, just like the visuals. I want to start with the voice performances throughout the game because they are fantastic. Obviously, I'm going to start with Deacon, the main character. He's played by Sam Witwer. You might know him from some other games like The Force Unleashed, or as a voice actor in pretty much any Star Wars project, or an actor in film and television. He's a pretty well-rounded guy. His performance as Deacon St. John really sells the character. I believe this guy is fucked up and mentally unwell because Sam Witwer nails it, especially showing some range for Deacon during the flashbacks with Sarah, playing a more put-together, charming guy rather than the on-again, off-again psycho we see in present day. And the quality of the performances extends to the rest of the main cast too. Courtney Draper as Sarah plays both ends of the character well, the nice city girl before the outbreak and the hardened survivor doing her best in the apocalypse. Jim Peary as Boozer also handles both ends of his character well, the depressive episode post-amputation, and the happy-go-lucky best friend. I could probably keep going, but these three are obviously the main forces in the story and the cast you hear the most from, so I think they're fine showcases of the quality of their performances. I do want to highlight Colonel Garrett's performance from Daniel Riordan. He really goes for that religious fervor and nails it. And the voice performances for the freaks sound disgusting. They're great too. The quality of the sound doesn't stop there though. The sound effects throughout the game are fantastic. Everything sounds heavy and real. Gunshots are intense, the wilderness is quiet, and your bike is roaring. I just love listening to this game. It is seriously top-notch quality and it just punches through my earphones. The directional audio is great, I can pinpoint exactly where a freak is approaching from, the growl of an engine over a hill is easily distinguishable from my own, it's all so good. Where things do fall apart for me is the soundtrack through the game. And no, I'm not going on another extended tangent about the licensed song in the game, I am already rethinking leaving those in the narrative section. I mean the moment-to-moment tracks you hear in gameplay. They all kind of blend together to me. They're all folksy survival tracks that sound desperate and lonely, and I really couldn't pick out a song that I was attached to other than the Freak theme. At least I think that's when it plays. I think the game has a layered soundtrack, meaning that different layers fade in and out as the intensity of the game rises and lowers, and that layering is really great with the Freak theme. It really does feel like an unstoppable force is catching up to you. Otherwise though, again, the tracks are pretty forgettable. But I do appreciate the decision that a lot of the time the music is pretty minimal. And not just because I don't particularly like the music, but I like when a game lets the world breathe on its own and lets you listen to what's around you like your character would. Days Gone really nails that, and only throws in tracks during the action or during cinematics, at least I think. Music does kind of overshadow cutscenes with the volume mixing, so this might cancel out my appreciation for the lack of music, but fair is fair, it felt worth mentioning. I think that does it for my thoughts on the audio throughout the game. The sounds are great, the people and voices are too, and the music could use some work in my opinion, but it isn't bad by any means. I do really like the licensed songs used, all 3 of them. I don't think I mentioned the one during the credits, but yeah, they're all good songs, and I think 2 of them were specifically composed for the game, so it makes a lot of sense that they fit much better. In 2025, almost exactly 6 years after Days Gone was released, a content update was pushed on PC alongside a PlayStation 5 upgrade. To round out this video, I figured the best way to go out before I wrap things up would be talking about this update, both what it changed in the base game and what it added that warranted the $10 price tag. Let's start with what changed. Firstly, the update claims to have changed and improved many graphical features like a new atmospheric lighting system and improved shadow resolutions with better screen space, indirect lighting, and ambient occlusion. That's a lot of words to say things should look better, specifically the lighting and shadows. Both should look more natural and softer. And I'm happy to say that it delivers. I booted up the game to quickly grab some extra footage of the radial menu before I planned on checking out the update, and I immediately noticed a change in the lighting. Things looked much better. The lighting was dramatic and full, the skybox looked new to me, and the ocean of stars looked fantastic. On top of that, the update specifies that night should look darker, and you bet they do. I made sure I left Lost Lake Camp at night, and it's an entirely different experience. One night felt like a soft blue filter over the game before, and now I really had to rely on my motorcycle and flashlight to see. And wow, look at that, Deacon wears a flashlight around his neck now. I can see why this took 6 years. The update also added some modern quality of life features like an enhanced suite of accessibility options and a more in-depth photo mode. I don't have much to add for either of these. I thankfully don't need the accessibility features, and photo modes are only fun for a few minutes unless you don't have any real hobbies. The game also added DualSense support, gaining features for those using a PlayStation 5 controller while playing, but again, I don't have much comment on those either since this isn't really relevant to me. All in all, for a next-gen update, it's fine. There's a difference in visual fidelity, some added features that will fly under the radar for most people, and I think the frame rate finally got unlocked on PC, so I guess that's cool. If I were playing on console and I had to pay for these upgrades, I'd be pretty underwhelmed, but thankfully there's gameplay content added behind that paywall. Horde Assault. It's a brand new instant game mode, much like the challenge mode, asking the player to fight massive hordes in section-offed portions of the map. When you enter the mode, you're prompted with a few choices. First, you pick which region you want to play in. You slowly unlock each by getting a certain score threshold on the previous map, and it seems like each map raises the stakes with larger hordes and more infected types. Next, you pick a character to play as. Again, like the challenge mode, this is just a cosmetic change. There's a few more characters added to this mode though, like Schizo and O'Brien. Then you can opt into injectors, or modifiers, which give you negative and positive benefits to your gameplay that affect your overall score. So things like unlimited stamina would net you a score deduction, but opting into reduced healing will get you a higher score multiplier. You can only choose 3 injectors per run. The variety of them is alright, but I didn't experiment with them too heavily to see if there were any fun combos or anything like that. So, you picked a region to fight in, a survivor to fight as, and some injectors to fight with. Now we can get into actually playing Horde Assault. When you begin a run, your initial objective is to fight off some small swarms until you can reach your motorcycle. You get a specific gun to start for each region and a small amount of supplies to get started. Once you reach your bike, the run opens up to you and you're expected to survive as long as you can. Throughout the region, you'll find supply boxes that will get you additional gear and weapons, though you can only unlock these by meeting specific score thresholds, and you can only choose one option to take from each box. Either a weapon, supplies for crafting, or throwables and placeables, or a little bump to your overall score. I like this enough. The weapon you can get from the boxes are presented to you right when you open the supply crate, so you don't have to gamble against the guaranteed items with the potential of a good gun. I think the pool of weapons in the box is a little too wide though. It seems like you can get literally any item in the game through the box, so sometimes you fight your way to a supply crate just to get a tier 1 pistol. I think keeping the low tier weapons to world pickups and enemy drops here in the mode would be preferred, and having tier 3 and higher weapons in the supply crates would make sure they're always a choice you have to balance against the other options. While you're playing through the mode and gearing up, you'll occasionally be prompted to optional objectives to net you additional supplies, ammo, and a bump to your score. These objectives are always very simple, asking you to kill a certain number of enemies or kill the freaks with a specific weapon type. I think these were a good inclusion. The guaranteed loot drops from completing these can keep you going for a while without having to swap to a new weapon or forcing you to hunt down a supply crate. I do think getting a little weirder with the objectives could have been fun, like asking you to get some airtime on your bike, or racing to specific locations on the map, or even just asking for like a headshot streak. I also think the difficulty of these optional objectives rising with the difficulty of the run would help the objectives feel less stale during an extended attempt. And for the core of the mode and the justification of that $10 price tag, we have extended and amplified horde sizes. They get massive in this mode, more than you'd ever see in the base game. As your run continues, horde sizes get larger and larger on an interval, slowly building up as you're gearing up. There's also what I'm calling set piece hordes, guaranteed large hordes that appear regardless of the spawn interval that seem to be intentionally placed in areas that might grab your attention, like the sawmill horde from the original reveal of the game. I think this is a fun idea too, but it confused me for a couple of runs before I realized I was bringing these hordes on myself. But again, I do like this. It's a fun way to reward the player for checking in on locations they remember from the base game. I do have a bit of a gripe with the horde spawns though. They seem pretty buggy. They definitely try to spawn out of the player's sightline, but sometimes this can lead to a few freaks, or even the entire horde, not figuring out where to spawn if you're in a location on the map the spawn placements deem awkward. I had a couple of hordes not appear entirely, forcing me to run around for a couple of minutes without any action, and a few hordes that didn't spawn the final freaks, again forcing me into a waiting game. This was the only issue I bumped into with the update and the new mode. It's not major or game breaking, but it is a bummer and definitely took me out of the action when it happened. When you complete a run, you gain some experience for the Horde Assault mode. Again, like the challenge mode, there's some independent progression here. You unlock new characters, new injectors, and some permanent upgrades for you in the Horde mode, like saddlebags on your bike. You can also unlock Deacon's fuel pump from the beginning of the base game. It was a gift from Sarah from before the outbreak that got parted out and never seen again. I guess it's fun that it's here finally, but this definitely felt like something that was going to come up in the base game originally, and I don't really care about a fuel tank upgrade now that I'm done playing the game. I honestly can't really see other players caring much about it either. On top of the Horde Assault mode, you also get 2 new game modes for the base game, Permadeath and Speedrun mode. I didn't look into these at all. I hope you didn't expect me to play through the game 2 more times just for this update, but please leave a comment about how I missed out on the full experience. These don't interest me whatsoever. Days Gone is not a game I would recommend speedrunning, and I can't imagine it's very fun to rush through. And Permadeath, no thank you. Most of my deaths in the game were from me driving recklessly, so if 20 hours of effort went down the drain just because of some wonky bike physics, I'll pass. Adding these into the paid update are kind of weird to me because I don't think they're very appealing additions, but I guess $10 for just one game mode didn't seem right? I don't know. All in all, it's a pretty good next-gen update and an alright paid DLC. The Horde Assault mode has some legs. I might end up hopping into it a few times before I'm fully done with Days Gone, but it isn't keeping me up late into the night for one more run. The next-gen improvements are nice, but it feels a little too late to be relevant in the conversation for the game. But maybe that was the point. Maybe this was an effort to reignite that candle. So, we're finally reaching the end of this video, a new record for longest on the channel. I always have trouble writing these closing thoughts without repeating myself too much, but I guess that is the point of a conclusion, and you made it this far, so what's another minute or two of me rambling? I think Days Gone was mischaracterized by the general audience, writing it off as another slow, cinematic PlayStation exclusive that's trying to ride on that zombie train that died somewhere in the mid-2010s, overall being a game that didn't deserve the attention past some cheap jokes. Days Gone is a great game, marred by some lackluster systems, an incredibly long runtime, and underwhelming side content until you reach the end game. The gameplay is fun and energetic, which leads to some great immersion gameplay, forcing you to improvise and think on your feet with how you can get the upper hand in a fight, or what you need to scrape by to the next one. Unfortunately, that gameplay gets stagnant with the player's power creep and an overabundance of supplies to make sure you never have to engage with the game fully like you did early on. The narrative has a very slow start, but once it gets going, it's a mostly enjoyable journey that has some hiccups with pacing and an over-reliance on cheap emotional tricks. If you can look past those, Deacon's story is a fun ride and one that I haven't forgotten since I played the game originally. I think you were wrong about Days Gone, just like I was, but hopefully I helped you give it another chance. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far in the video, consider subscribing to see more from me in the future. Next up will be a video on Condemned Criminal Origins, and there will definitely be more to come after that. I also tried streaming my playthrough of Condemned Criminal Origins for the video, and it was pretty fun, so maybe look out for something similar to that with other games on the channel as well.